We will now begin today's event. I would now like to welcome Dr. Taylor.
Well, hello, greetings, family, friends, and colleagues. Welcome to this unique virtual event hosted by Treatment Communities of America and the World Federation of Therapeutic Communities. In my capacity as president of the World Federation, it gives me great pleasure to see so many familiar faces, as well as many others who are yet unknown to us. Welcome. Thank you all for being here, and also thank you for the outstanding work that you are doing in your own unique communities. I would like to express my appreciation to the leadership of TCA, Ed Carlson, Steve Verma, and Pat Clay for the outstanding job of co-hosting and organizing this event. My thanks also to the staff who are behind the scenes, making sure that everything goes according to plan, and you know who you are. Allow me to express my profound gratitude to the officers of the World Federation for their extraordinary dedication and commitment to service. They are as diverse as they are talented. Garth Popple from Australia, Richard Steinberg from the United States, Enrico Costa from Italy, Vaden Galatarakis from Greece, who also serves as president of the European Federation of Therapeutic Communities, and Martin Infante from the Philippines, who does double duty as president of the Asian Federation of Therapeutic Communities. Well, today, we are gifted with a panel of outstanding speakers. A more experienced, talented, and stimulating group of individuals would be difficult to assemble. Thank you all for agreeing to share the wisdom of your life's work with us. I am very much looking forward to your presentations. You know, TC staff members are at their very best when they use their ingenuity to address the persistent problems that we all face. Our members excel at tackling new and emerging problems. Last year, we were confronted with the COVID-19, and today we're still learning how to overcome the residual challenges presented by this pandemic. COVID-19 has impacted all sectors of health and wellness at every level of our society. In addition to the public health crises, we are confronting a rise in mental health problems, as well as an increase in substance use disorders. We are unfortunately also confronted by an increase in incidents of suicide and depression, as well as general anxiety that has been created because our ecological systems are in flux. The current situation presents significant challenges at every level of our service delivery systems. The challenges include the following: fiscal stability and sustainability, providing effective leadership while maintaining organizational culture and values, quality maintenance at administrative, fiscal, and programmatic levels, ongoing communication with our community partners, managing stability and quality of our services, incorporating new technologies and evidence-based practices, caring for the well-being of staff and our participants, and of course, planning for the future, because there is a future. Flexibility, innovation, and strategic interventions are necessary during this time of crisis and disruption. Aligning our services with clear patterns of relevance and confidence is vital. But remember, it is during a time of crises that opportunities for innovation and for excellence can prevail. Developing new models of care, restructuring existing service protocols, and the active evaluation of these innovations can help us to build a solid foundation for our future. Let us remember that we in the therapeutic community sector are adept at meeting challenges. We always rise to the occasion. We do so with creativity and with determination. Our guiding principles include collaboration, strength-based care, family involvement, accountability, and a respect for cultural norms and traditions. Even though the demographics of our clients are ever-changing, so are the programs that serve these clients. However the challenge, our member organizations are more than ready to meet these challenges. Our colleagues have continued to demonstrate our core values, which include the fundamental belief that overcoming adversity, such as addiction and social dislocation, in my opinion, transforms lives. These lives then transform communities as agents of great social change. We see further challenges ahead, and it is with this look towards the future that we must acknowledge the extraordinary accomplishments of TCA and the many other therapeutic communities across the world. As we know that you have faced many challenges during these critical times. My recognition goes especially to the staff and volunteers on the front lines who provide services and continue to change lives regardless of the obstacles they face. You are commended for all that you continue to do. You are a credit to us all. In closing, I regret that we are unable to meet in person. And once again, my sincere appreciation to those fine representatives of TCA for organizing this event. Please continue the great work that you are engaged in, all of you, because you are truly making a difference. You know, they say that the course of social change is limited only by our vision and by our commitment to see that vision through. I am reminded of the words of the American philosopher William James when he said, and I quote, "Let all things you do be done as if it makes a difference," end quote. I know that we will all continue to make a difference. And for that, I salute you all. I thank you all, and good luck, and continue the fine work you are doing. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Taylor. We really appreciate that introduction and all your hard work and efforts behind the scene. My name is Ed Carlson. I'm the CEO of Odyssey House and the president of TCA. So on behalf of Treatment Communities of America, we'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. WFTC TCA training. Right now we have over 600 people registered, and I look down here at the bottom of the screen and we have 418 people logged in. A few people are a little late, you know, in the TC, that would be a consequence. But we're looking forward to working with everybody and going through the process. We know that some of the programs are sharing single registrations, which means our actual numbers in attendance is much higher. We are honored that so many people interested in today's the changing aspect of the therapeutic community model training. The therapeutic community is ever-evolving, group-based approach to treating substance use disorders since the emergence of the model in the late 1950s. Many factors have since led to changes and modifications within the TC program, from funding restrictions to changing social attitudes and scientific recognition of addiction as a medical disorder. While the behavioral health field continues to change and shift, the lasting success of TCs show why the TC model has been adopted in more than 65 countries around the world. Next slide, please. Oh, I think I'm a slide ahead. Actually, back slide, please. Thank you. So today, we have put together an esteemed panel of some of the leading experts in the TCs, addiction treatment and specialty population. We will more fully introduce our panelists as we move into their respective sections of this training. However, we are thrilled to have Dr. George DeLeon and Naya Arbiter as our keynote speakers, and are also pleased to share the expertise of TCA members in a panel discussion on the specialty populations of adults, adolescents, family, children, and corrections. Next slide, please. I have a few things to note, a few housekeeping items I want to make everybody to be aware of. So first of all, if you're trying to talk, nobody hears you, it's because you're muted. Everybody's automatically muted. Throughout the webinar, to control background noise. So questions for our keynote speakers and panelists are welcome. As questions arise, please feel free to enter your questions into the Q&A box in the bottom panel of our Zoom screen. Please utilize the Q&A section for questions, not the chat function. Keep in mind that we will hold all questions for both keynote and our panelists until all speakers have presented. Be sure to note whom your questions are for when submitting them. And if it's general open, just simply mention that it's generally open. Spanish interpretation is available for this webinar. You may access this by clicking the interpretation icon in the bottom banner of your Zoom screen. You may switch back and forth from English to Spanish throughout the presentation if you choose. This training is being recorded. It will be available to all attendees after the presentation ends. And we will also post a link to the Treatment Communities of America website, where a link will be where you can find the presentation. And it will be there for as long as we need to, and you can feel free to share it as much as you want. We will also upload the presentation to YouTube, where it can be translated into additional languages by Google Translate. So anybody, any language in any country should be able to access this. We will notify attendees when this function is available. With all that said, I am pleased to hand off to my colleague and TCA First Vice President, Seep Varma. Seep is the president and CEO of New York Therapeutic Communities Incorporated Staying Out, a New York-based nonprofit operating multiple community-based residential and outpatient programs, utilizing the TC, and a pioneer in the adaptation of TC chemical dependency treatment methods into the prison setting. Seep was instrumental in coordinating of this training, and TCA is lucky to have his overall knowledge and expertise and his participation on the executive committee, as well as a very active member. I want to welcome Seep to introduce our keynote speakers. And everybody enjoy, and thank you all so much for being here.
Great. Good afternoon. For those on the East Coast, good morning and good evening to others. Ed, I appreciate that those kind words and that generous introduction. And I too am pleased to see the enormous turnout and interest in our session here today. For those of you that got on the session and immediately felt warm inside and smiled as a result of that wonderful music that was shared by Ed and his colleagues in New Orleans, you are in the right place, and this is the right training for you. It certainly brought in a little spirit of the TC into our session this afternoon. And a lot of what we're doing today is to try to keep that spirit alive, feeding the spirit of the TC and keeping our energy in that direction is something that's very important. While all too often our meetings are focused on structural issues, funding, healthcare, and other things, it is very important to keep the clinical model and the clinical integrity of the TC alive. And I'm very thrilled to be a part of this session today that attempts to do that. Our first keynote speaker today truly needs no introduction to this group. Dr. George De Leon is an internationally recognized authority on treatment and research, especially regarding the therapeutic community model. He was the vice president and director of research at Phoenix Programs in the United States, and the principal investigator and director of the NIDA-funded CTCR, the Center for Therapeutic Community Research, as well as a founding member and former president of the American Psychological Association's Division on Addiction and a clinical professor at NYU School of Medicine. He has published over 170 scientific papers and chapters, authored and edited several books and monographs, including The Therapeutic Community Theory, Model, and Method, which is considered a defining text in the field of TCs. His training videos include those on essential elements and the 13 stages of recovery. Dr. De Leon is a recipient of numerous national and international awards. I know that George also recently celebrated his birthday, so happy birthday, George. I won't make all 500 of us sing you happy birthday like we might in a TC morning meeting, but I'm thrilled that you're here today and that you're going to share your knowledge with us. And without further ado, Dr. De Leon.
Thank you, Seep. I'm going to resist the birthday, but I appreciate your thinking of me that way. Greetings, everybody, and it's terrific for me to recontact with colleagues and friends, and I really appreciated this invitation to be here, and I mean that sincerely. Because, of course, we're in time limits, I'm going to read directly. I hope that doesn't sound too stilted, but if you follow it, I think we can make the points that we want to make. Incidentally, the approach that I took to this talk was to try to provide a broader context for many of the considerations that you're going to go through, the changes or the training issues that you may want to confront. My hope is that this presentation will contribute to your efforts on this. So you can see in this first slide, to capture this idea is that I'm framing the therapeutic community phenomenon in terms of an evolutionary arc to give you a sense of what what historically, of course, you can look at, but essentially what we mean by the evolutionary arc in terms of going forward. Next slide. So here's the overview of many of the key points that would be made. Therapeutic communities were developed by the first participants outside of conventional medicine and mental health to become a major approach in the treatment of opiate and other substances of use. You got to remember that, of course. We began as a marginal outside phenomenon, not part of traditional public health, and evolved into a powerful mainstream public health approach. Viewed from an evolutionary perspective, modern TCs emerged during an earlier epidemic of heroin abuse in the 1960s. Evaluations of these first-generation programs yielded impressive outcomes and potentiated a rapid expansion of TCs in treating substance abuse disorders in a variety of population and special settings. However, somewhere around 1980, and I won't speak too much about this, as it assumed the characteristics of a mainstream public health entity, the TC approach itself faced a paradoxical threat. All the way back around 1980, it continues forward in my mind, as we'll talk about in a few minutes. And that is the potential loss of its mutual self-help identity that has defined its success. These keynote remarks that I'm making today briefly trace the 50-year evolutionary arc of the North American TC. I say North American, that's had a lot of implications worldwide, but it's the one that I can document most closely in terms of yearly changes. And I'm going to talk about it briefly just in terms of main accomplishments, critical challenging issues in modifying the approach, and offer some considerations going forward. Next slide. So if we look at the evolutionary arc in terms of accomplishments, try to summarize this in some very, very terse statements. Of course, all of these need more discussion, but that's for another time. The accelerated diffusion of the TC worldwide may be viewed as a an evolutionary movement. We used to believe that, from the marginal to the mainstream of substance abuse treatment. This can be summarized in terms of several major accomplishments. The considerable research documenting the fact of recovery, the effectiveness and cost benefits of TC treatment. The reason why I have that as number one, the fact of recovery, is you remember in our history, there was a phrase that essentially described addiction and kind of dismissed it. And you can probably finish it: once a junkie, always a junkie. And so the reality is that as TCs began to do their work and we began to do the research to see whether they were working, the fact of recovery was documented fairly early. A second major accomplishment is that the application of the approach, of course, for special populations and settings going through the years, all of you are familiar with that, how many different populations we've been dealing with, how many different settings, whether it's hospitals, shelters, correctional centers, and so on. All of that is well-known knowledge now, but the important part about that is to take essentially a mutual self-help model and bring that into mainstream settings that essentially had an effect of humanizing a lot of those settings, was a profound accomplishment. But more than that, as I'll talk about a little bit later, the research on those special populations and special settings was also showing impressive outcomes. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. And a third major accomplishment is the emergence of a bona fide TC theory and method derived from decades of practice and research. A moment ago, I mentioned that the approach essentially emerged from the first participants themselves, putting together this remarkable phenomenon on a daily trial and error basis without any theory. We have now gradually learned over the years in terms of success rates, as well as dropouts and the number of problems, that in fact, we can now formulate a pretty stable theory of the therapeutic community approach and essentially use that as a basis for training and research. So that is a third major accomplishment over the years. We are no longer an alternative treatment, marginal treatment. There's a systematic approach here. Now, unfortunately and paradoxically, that approach is best implemented in long-term residential treatment. I'm going to come back to that as a major issue in the evolution. And finally, here is an accomplishment that's hardly ever acknowledged: the development of cadres of recovered counselors and coaches who contributed to the drug treatment field in general and the recovery movement in particular. The thousands of graduates and even long-term dropouts who emerged from many TC programs essentially formed one of the first systematic labor forces in terms of the recovery movement, along with other sources, of course. But it was a non-traditional professional group, that is our group, and they basically established really the first labor force for the drug treatment system, at least which would focus on the idea of recovery. Let's go to the next slide. So what were some of the major issues that have essentially challenged the TC over some 50, 60 years? Well, again, we can talk endlessly about this, and many of you understand it from the ground up in terms of regulations and funding and planned duration of treatment. But I want to essentially review that quickly with you. The fact that we've had, as we now know, the gradual decrease in planned duration of treatment from the original model as it was developing. The 9 to 12, in fact, 18 to 24 month model, believe it or not, over the years, it's gradually decreased, has had made a profound challenge to the model. We had everything we knew about how to promote recovery through a long-term time correlated process, which means you needed time to do that, among other things, was being challenged by simply funding issues, and that relates, of course, to planned duration of treatment, and finally also even residential treatment in general. So we've had to constantly adapt to the changing resources around that, the shrinking time and program to stay effective. A second major development, of course, has been the lack of a TC experienced workforce once we expanded. And that is, we had a workforce initially, but once we moved into all these other populations and settings, we had to essentially begin integrating with other kinds of workforces, which we would call more traditional, which were social workers, psychologists, and so on, people who weren't necessary in the model in order to treat the special or deal with some of the special characteristics of those populations. But in that process of trying to bring up together to integrate two staffs, which essentially one that came out of direct recovery experiences and those that came out of more traditional mental health experiences or correctional experiences, this has constantly presented a challenge to how well we can implement the models. And we've done well with it, but it's been a continual, presenting continual hurdles, but also promoted some important new training strategies. Here's the third point, and this is the big one for me. So this you can lay on me if you like, but having the opportunity to look at it over a number of years, this is the one I'm most worried about. And I call this the erosion in the fidelity of treatment. That if you look over 50, 60 years, the issue of how well we implement what we know in the TC, that is, what are its elements, how well we really train them, how well we really implement them. And if you look at that curve in terms of fidelity, one of the kind of basic casualties of the successful evolution of the TC, paradoxically, was to essentially begin seeing the erosion of the fidelity of at least the long-term approach. And this, of course, has, from my point of view, is a special issue that needs to be attended to. Again, we'll talk about it in the next couple of slides. And then finally, the need for a new research agenda. Here's a point I want to make again. We got on the map eventually through having research demonstrate that we can work, even though research has always been challenged by traditional researchers. We've established that worldwide. There are issues to talk about in terms of how do you improve research. But one of the issues is we have not had a coherent new research effort since 2000. We have studies that occur here and there that involve TCs, but we have essentially been unable to launch a new coherent organized research effort which can document what we've been doing over the past 15 and 20 years, not what we did over the first 30 and 40 years. Again, a point that we may have a moment to talk a bit about. Next slide. So look, I want to try to quickly call this a current status. What if we look at the field from different ways today, roughly 55, 60 years after it was launched, the mainstreaming itself, the fact that we have moved purposefully toward the mainstream. This is something what TCs wanted from the beginning, to get into the mainstream. Mainstreaming, its accomplishments and issues, has profoundly impacted the current terrain of TCs and its future outlook. TC agencies have successfully modified, as you know, and adapted to provide a range of substance abuse and services, health services, and so on. We serve all these populations in short-term residential, day treatment, outpatient, correctional settings, characteristics that you'll hear about most of the day. That's all very successful. Today, the modality is a diverse collection of agencies that can be described in terms of, I try to describe, in terms of three broad categories. An optimal TC, and this is both the real and ideal that I've always been concerned with in terms of the promise and potential of the TC as a unique approach. A TC modified, a TC oriented. In other words, there are a lot of programs that call themselves TCs, but when you look at them, you can see they're actually there are various degrees of TC-ness, if you like, which is this next bullet. These three categories reflect how closely programs adhere to the perspective, views of the disorder, the view of the person, the view of recovery, the view of right living, and how much they adhere to the program model, which is the program structure, the social and hierarchical structure, the various activities of groups and meetings and how they're implemented, and how much they adhere to the actual approach. Community as method, which I'll come back to, but the headline around adhering to community as a method approach describes what we mean by that is the interaction between the individual and the community, and it's in the end the community that assists the individual in changing themselves. How well we do that essentially defines many differences across these programs. How much time we have to do that is also another issue on that. So the price, I call this a kind of main price of mainstreaming, has been the decline of the optimal TC. We've had success in the way we have met the challenges of the world. The worry for me, and I'm trying to convey that worry for you also, is the optimal TC and its great promise and potential for transformation. And ultimately, that's going to mean the long-term, what I call the long-term high fidelity residential TCs, which defined its initial success. Now, that doesn't mean going back to the original TC. It means the gradual cultivation of a potent long-term model, which we've now learned, which only began with the success of the original examples, but we now know have incorporated a lot of other elements to basically bring it around to being potentially a transformational approach that still needs to be pursued. We don't have that unless we have at least one example of long-term residential TCs being able to implement the full community as method approach. The next slide. So that's a current summary. But look, I think there's an inflection point in the evolutionary arc. We've always seen over the years periods when we were able to get some funding for long-term residential treatment, and then of course some of the big agencies still retain long-term residential treatment. But often, though, of course, they simply recede. The funding issues begin to take us down again, so that we can't essentially carry out those long-term models. But there is I think there's another inflection point that I'm learning about in these recent months. That is potential funding for long-term residential treatment. And this offers us, again, another opportunity in the evolutionary arc to launch a new era. But I'm focusing now for the moment on the long-term model. So be patient with me on this. What we have learned from decades of clinical and research experience can enhance the effectiveness of the long-term TC, particularly populations, for particular populations that we know actually need it most, but also sustain the long-term model beyond temporary inflection points of funding. In other words, that opportunity that I'm talking about now is that we can now do it. We can relaunch long-term therapeutic communities or rework current long-term therapeutic communities, residential therapeutic communities, in such a way now where we can more stabilize or guarantee their long-term stability in the evolution, that is, be less threatened, and make it a necessary component of the entire human service system. Let's have the next slide. So what have we learned? Well, the approach has been demonstrated. Here's what we've learned. This is mainly now coming out of the research. Has been demonstrated primarily in residential programs with planned durations of treatment of 9 to 12, followed by 6 to 12 months of reentry, whether it's correctional TCs or community-based TCs, programming in residential and non-residential settings. That first thing that we have learned from research tells us if you want to get long-term goals achieved, you need enough time to do them. A second thing that we have learned is that the research documenting the effectiveness of modified TCs, co-occurring disorders, for example, and other modifications, even medicated assisted treatment, modified Ts for special populations and those in correctional settings, the early research upon which a lot of our modified TC was built, but the early research was done on actually longer-term residential models. They were done on 9 to 12-month models, so that we haven't yet really demonstrated the success and effectiveness of 3 to 6 month programs or whatever outpatient programs we have. We haven't clearly answered those questions. The volume of that original research that ran from basically 1968 to up through 2003, the volume of those outcome studies firmly documented a relationship between retention, as you know, and time and program and post-treatment outcomes. You need the time as well as the fidelity of the approach to do the work of achieving long-term goals. The effectiveness of long-term residential treatment is highly related. This is a second, this next bullet, and it's the one I'm going to probably end a lot of the talk on in a few moments, but the effectiveness of long-term residential treatment, we learned, is highly related to program fidelity. So it's not simply the issues of dropout and retention and keeping people in treatment. We all know those issues. But it turns out is how well we were implementing and getting better and better at implementing community as method was a contributing factor to whether we were being effective or not. And as I've said, that fidelity had been becoming variable and decreasing. So the research documents that long-term residential treatment is the treatment of choice For the most serious substance abusers, in terms of severity of substance abuse, psychological problems, social deviancy, social dislocation, many who are socially marginalized, that approach is the treatment of choice for them. The research shows that. Let me go to the next slide. So based on what we've learned, we can go forward. I got 3 brief considerations, just going through what we mean by optimal. We need, of course, to remind ourselves of what the essential elements are and what we mean by that. That is, what is the actual perspective of the TC that should guide the implementation of all of its activities, relationship between how we see the disorder in the person and so on, and then what we do about it. And then the second thing that we have to focus on is fidelity approach, this training and fidelity assessment, and then evaluating high fidelity programs only. So let me just go to the last couple of slides to detail some of that. Next slide. So again, for those of you that need reminders, what I mean, at least by the TC perspective, we've always been, our programs have been implemented based on an understanding that we have. And the understanding is we have a view of what the disorder is, whole person. We have a view of who the individual is. We have typical characteristics that we lay out about individuals in terms of how issues of personal honesty, issues of responsibility, issues of impulse management, and so on. We have a pretty specific view about what characteristics of individuals need to change in order for them to move forward. We have a view of recovery that differs from everyone else. We have said from the first days, for our concept of recovery was essentially lifestyle change and identity change. It started with abstinence, but it really had to do with real transformation and learning how to live right. The TC approach, I'm just reviewing these elements now, is best captured in this phrase, in case you haven't been aware of this. What our approach really, how we can define briefly our approach in the therapeutic community, not a therapeutic community setting, but the approach. It's the purpose of using a community to teach the individuals to utilize the community to change themselves. We, as when an individual walks into a long-term therapeutic community, the community is going to be used to teach them how to use the community itself, everything that goes on, relationships, activities, all the roles of that community and so on, how to change themselves. So again, talking about essential elements, that is the understanding of what we mean by community as method. And when you want to look at a high fidelity community, I always ask the question, is this community actually going through the process of teaching individuals how to use the community to change themselves? And the other essential element is the program model, and that is, have many of the fundamental, that's my guy, fundamental structural elements, groups, meetings, seminars, affirmations, corrections, for all of that, and then a stage phase format. All of that has been consistent as a program model. That's a program model to help facilitate long-term change. And finally, this last point, the TC change process. Do we really understand the TC change process between individuals and the community? It can be summarized as this. We know that individuals who ultimately go through the process form a relationship with the community. When they form that relationship with the community, they begin to essentially try to meet the expectations of the community about how to change. That's how they're learning to do it. And that's why when I want to capture the change process in a single sentence in the community, I say to residents, if you participate, then you will change. So let me go to this final slide, this next slide, if it's there. Well, we have fidelity. This is the fidelity slide. And what I'm getting at here, of course, this is the new era of moving forward. How much fidelity training is really needed, particularly if you're in long-term residential treatment. And that has to do with, you focus on a curriculum, and the fundamental element around training fidelity is why we do what we do. In other words, everything in the therapeutic community is designed to produce change in the individual. We should be able to explain that to ourselves and to the residents about why we do what we do. then there is this terrific, important development in fidelity. How do we incorporate non-TC evidence-based practices in curricula to deal with the wide diversity of the population that we deal with? One of the problems in evolution is that we have done that at the expense frequently of community as method. So the issue is you have to see these very important and useful evidence-based practices as enhancements, but not substitutes for community as method. Our people change in long-term TCs because of their relationship to the community and what they've learned about themselves. And so that's the fundamental approach. A lot of other enhancements are very useful and help us do that. But you've got to remember, the primary approach is community as method. And then finally, you want to train fidelity is through all kinds of immersion models, which we know something about. All kinds of different staff have to be trained together to produce didactic and experiential learning. Incidentally, in some of my recent work now, particularly in not only in research, but in training, I've also included training for the residents themselves in the theory. So sustaining high fidelity TC program requires continual observation of fluctuations in program quality, and the fidelity assessment, therefore, is a necessary and an ongoing activity. So what this slide is simply is communicating, if you've had an opportunity to look at it, is the three critical elements in how we have to raise our entire fidelity training approach. So this last point is you periodically have to watch the program. It's always undergoing some level of erosion spontaneously anyway. You've got to constantly watch it and essentially correct it by continued training. And the next slide. The last point on this is that this one goes close to the heart of the whole research issue. Much of the research in recent decades has been conducted on community and correctional-based residential programs of unknown and variable fidelity. That's the recent 20 years of research, which there hasn't been enough of, but that level of research. Results have been inconsistent, which has influenced funding for long-term residential treatment. You may not be aware of that. While the overall research volume has decreased, as I mentioned earlier, it's also been true that most of that research that's been done has been on variable or unmeasured or poor fidelity programs. So you get inconsistent results on this, which has kind of undermined the picture of the original promise and potential of the TC. So we need to promote a new era of evaluation studies only on high fidelity long-term programs or any high fidelity program. That's the one that communicates the most accurate picture. Do we have another slide? I think we do. Well, this is the way I envisioned going forward. This is a little bit of my delusion, so you'll indulge me for a moment. And what we teach when we're really teaching the promise and potential of the long-term treatment model is right living. It's not a simple problem. We're teaching people how to live. How we teach it, we do that by experience and didactically, by both teaching and healing. And who are the teachers? Well, it's all of us. It's staff and their role as a faculty role as role models, and other residents and their participant as role models. That's a simple way I think about it. If we can keep retrain those three elements, we can guarantee a high fidelity TC. I'm going to stop there. I know we have another slide, but I want to stop right there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, George, for those remarks. Very thought-provoking and very on target with a lot of what the contemporary issues are, not only in the United States, but to our colleagues around. I want to, if I can, bring up our next keynote speaker, who again is an icon, a hero in our field, who really needs not much introduction. Our second keynote speaker this afternoon is Naya Arbiter. Ms. Arbiter began her work at Amity in 1981 and has been responsible for the total transformation of this excellent organization and its recognition both nationally and internationally as one of the most innovative and effective TC programs. She has developed restorative paradigms for those marginalized through addiction, poverty, racism, sexism, trauma, and violence. Has been recognized for the development of pro-social strategies for people that represent these populations. Her efforts in prisons have evidenced the highest recidivism reduction with the most criminogenic population that has ever been studied. She has authored 14 volumes of TC curriculum, which foster personal growth, emotional literacy, and social responsibility. Naya has also served on the Inter-American Commission for Drug Policy, vice president of TCA, chair of the Standards and Goal Committees, Standards and Goal Committee of the World Federation of TCs, and numerous scientific committee advisory boards that include the National Treatment Improvement Evaluation Study. She was also chosen as one of the conferees of the White House Conference on Drugs for a Drug-Free America by President Reagan. In 2013, she was the second American and the first woman to ever receive the Acknowledgement Award from the European Federation of Therapeutic Communities, given to those acknowledged to have made the greatest contribution in the ongoing development of the therapeutic community method. Naya is currently the vice president of the Amity Foundation. A native New Yorker, she spent much of her adolescence between New York, Bolivia, and Mexico. In her late teens, she moved to the American Southwest and became involved in using and smuggling drugs over the Mexico-Arizona border. Arrested in Mexico, but released from jail before her 18th birthday, she was given a well-constructed chance by a courageous probation officer to go to the first ever American TC program, Synanon. Her life's work has been to construct chances for those in seemingly impossible situations. Currently lives in Arizona with her husband, 3 dogs, 3 cats, and 2 parrots. I want to welcome Naya, and I'm sure that all of you will enjoy her remarks. Thank you.
Good.
That's it. Naya, just unmute and you can go anytime you're ready.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you very much, Steve, for introducing me. So, first slide, please. Okay, and second slide, please. Thank you. So, greetings, community, ladies and gentlemen, estimados señoras y señores. Thank you so much for the invitation to speak. Thank you for your work, for the thousands of people you represent, and condolences to all of you who have lost loved ones to COVID and to gun violence. It's been a tough period of time. Thank you, George, for your demonstration over the decades of whole person engagement, for mentoring both the movement and the model of the TC nationally and internationally, for encouraging us to re-envision the therapeutic community, for encouraging us to stand on our base of fidelity to the model. Thank you for the battles that you've waged to make sure that we had a research base, for your music, for your humor. Jazz is both an individual and a community membership activity. Flo Kennedy taught us years ago that you can't have a revolution without humor and music. Gordon Parks said that if a person can reach the latter days of life with their soul intact, they've mastered life. So will the TC move forward with its soul intact? Next slide, please. Helen Luke shared that the world has not moved along so much by the battles it has won and lost, rather by the stories that it has loved and believed in. Hannah Arendt, storytelling reveals meaning without the error of defining it. So moving forward, there's an important piece for all of us to reclaim the story and build it forward of our therapeutic and teaching communities. The citizens of the world right now are reviewing story. Germany has made reparations to Namibia. Greta Thunberg has motivated millions of young people to examine their relationship to the planet. Brian Stevenson's Equal Justice Initiative sends out a story every single day regarding racial injustice entitled On This Day. He's calling for a new era of truth and justice and inclusion. He tells stories of slavery, of First Nations, of genocide, of Asian, Jewish, and Mexican American exclusion. Illinois has made Asian American studies a requirement in school. Jack Forbes, the Native American activist and historian, stressed that while we the living are not responsible for what our ancestors did, we are responsible for the societies that we live in, which is a product of our past. So social context is critical. From corporate America to grassroots movements to statues of the Confederacy, we're flipping the box on America's story, and around our world, the real story of colonization is beginning to move towards a wider truth. So where's the TC today? What's our story? What story will we carry forward into our future? Today, around the world, TCs have expanded the movement to reflect many of the issues of our time. Phoenix Futures in the UK responded to a call for action from the European Federation and announced in 2019 that their TCs would be carbon neutral by 2021. They exceeded their goal and they did it by 2020. Shimane Asahi Prison in Japan uses the TC model for restorative justice. The documentary movie on this project called Prison Circle by Kori Sakagami has won every prestigious award for documentaries in Japan and is impacting the national perspective on corrections. In both Australia and New Zealand, TC practitioners preface presentations acknowledging the First Nations, and those governments have included in their justice systems the concepts and practices of those that are native to their land. Much of this work has come out of the work that the TCs did there. In Greece, Katheia, the movement is so strong that TCs survived national economic collapse, and practitioners suffering pay cuts and more moved in to different campuses and helped preserve the work. In Ireland, the Cool 9 TC represents perhaps one of the most robust creative centers for family and children that I've seen. In Spain, the efforts of Proyecto Hombre have transformed entire neighborhoods and thousands of families for the better. In Italy, the women of the Dianova Foundation have demonstrated humbling work with adolescents. And in Peru, we have Instituto Mundo Libre. In Mexico, El Salvador, TC concepts are addressing street children and gangs, creating organic gardens, and addressing the issues of our time, acknowledging that abandonment, abuse, criminality, addiction are symptoms of larger ills. Next slide, please. George keeps encouraging us to re-envision our work. We have the small circle of the drug program, which of course is symptoms. We then developed the therapeutic community, which is whole person education. And part of re-envisioning, I would like to suggest to you, is that we re-envision ourselves as teaching and therapeutic communities. About 60 years ago, Zev Putterman, who is the third person on methadone in the United States, the 39th person to enter Synanon, he graduated and became the winner of 13 Emmy Awards, ran QED TV in California, believed by the 1990s, he said, you know, we should call ourselves TC, Teaching Community, because never has there been a greater need for community. So starting in the 90s at Amity Foundation, we refer to ourselves as part of the re-envisioning process as a teaching and therapeutic community. Next slide. TC, Teaching Community, a microcosm that serves as a mirror reflecting the problems of our time as they're manifested in individuals. Within the inclusive sanctuary of community, people engage in therapia, the work of the whole. Teaching and learning from each other in community accelerates learning in the emotional, intellectual, cultural, moral, and spiritual realms. Community as method. Next slide, please. The word remember, of course, comes from the Latin root recordare, which means to pass again through the heart. Remember is the opposite of dismember. Remember, to bring back together the separated pieces. What might we remember in terms of our own story and pass one more time through our heart? Well, the original TC rejected a faith-based recovery model developed by white, well-educated men who understood powerlessness from a position of having been empowered once. The original TC revolted against the purely medical interventions of shock treatments, straitjackets, LSD experiments. The activities were referred to as self-actualizing activities and community-building activities rather than treatment. The first TC grew out of the civil rights movement. At its center were interracial relationships, which in the 1950s and early 60s were still illegal in many states in the United States. The TC was a revolution of inclusion. At its center those early days, were those blacklisted in the McCarthy era, many who joined the ex-addicts, supporting their right to help each other and help themselves. And they too became senior professors, sharing their stories, sharing their moral compass, why they had stood up for the Scottsboro Boys, the young Mexican men charged with the Sleepy Lagoon murders. At the center of the first TC were African-American women who were largely ignored in society, who found a place, a second chance, liberated into competence, running campuses, getting donations, and teaching grace notes to the youngsters. The first TC board of directors included Native American, Mexican American, African American, Jew, Gentile, and Muslim. The mission was to engage in research and investigation into the causes of personal alienation, not the symptoms, the causes. The idea was to create empowerment, transformation, self-actualization, and most importantly, community. Next slide, please. There was the movement before there was the model. There was an essence before there was the form. There was the soul before there was structure. And there was community before there was a corporation. Each TC at its best has duende. Garcia Lorca tells us duende is a force, not a labor. It surges up from the soles of your feet. It's not a question of skill. It's truly alive. It's in the veins, duende. A mysterious force that everyone can feel and no philosopher or scientist can completely explain. So will we embrace the model at the expense of the movement, the form at the expense of the essence, the structure to the degree that we lose our soul, and revere the corporate model at the expense of community? Or will we pass again through our hearts what we know to be true, the fidelity to the model, and find ways to re-envision, as George says, and apply what we know works to the people that we serve today? There are many who challenge us and say that our history is based on a shame-based model. Were there mistakes? Of course. Were there abuses in some places? Absolutely. Such is the story of any movement that's fighting the first battles for a cause. Dr. De Leon has consistently encouraged us to tell the story of our collateral benefits. This is so important. For what an insult it is to those who labored long and hard before us not to tell the whole story and allow the narrow mythology of us only being a shame-based movement to persist. Think of Ronnie Williams staying out and being locked in Sally Ports in prison. Think of George De Leon fighting as hard as he did for research. Judy Ann Denson Gerber testifying about heroin use with children in Harlem. Mimi Silbert staying the course for decades with Delancey Street. Mitch Rosenthal, Richard Pruss, Betty Dieterich, Oscar Camaño, Ted Dibble, Ray Dibble, Sonia Page, Lena Lindsay, Kevin McEnany, John Malhar, Louis Yablonsky, Charles Devlin, Robert Kennedy Jr., who supported the effort, Senator Thomas Dodd, Jim Inciardi, Senator Nick Petras, who defined the TCs as a place of aid, not a hospital. Many American TCs don't know their own history, let alone the history of the movement. So let us remember the thousands who stayed up night after night, helping people kick habits, encouraging them, loving them, listening to them, and mentoring to them. Next slide, please. Challenges: corporation or community? Social service plus social justice equals social progress. Warning, warning. Exclusion rather than inclusion, competition rather than collaboration equals community destruction and the downfall of community as method. Next slide, please. Corporate structure should exist to serve social progress and community. The triangle should be inside, the structure should be inside of the community itself. The community should continue to grow. We have wonderful applications of our model, with the corporation being supportive of it, rather than the corporation that feeds off the backs of the indigent, swallowing and destroying community in the interests of corporate need and corporate greed. Next slide. Part of fidelity to the model starts with inverting the pyramid. In a corporate structure, the executives are at the top and the students coming in for help are at the bottom. If you flip that around, think about it as a funnel and the executives being at the bottom of a robust funnel of information, keeping them current to the issues that are presented by the people we serve. Next slide. What is truly valued in our TCs today? A faculty member might be at the, quote, bottom of the triangle, but the core of the community. Do we bank character of acknowledging demonstration? Do we regularly write letters to the personnel files of people regarding their contribution to the community? Or do we just use our personnel files as a way of documenting mistakes? The faculty is the first community. Do we build it? Do we develop community as method amongst the faculty? To those of you who are executives, think for a moment, how many letters of commendation have you written in the last year to the TC practitioners who have mentored, saved a life, taken a risk, included a family? Next slide, please. Membership. To promote fidelity to the model, everyone has a job, of course, but everyone in the corporate structure, everyone is a member of the community. It's not either or, it's both and. There's a reciprocal relationship. Can't have an inside of a glass without there being an outside. Do all of the employees in your TC have a membership role? Do they serve a meal once a month? Do they create a birthday party? Do they read stories to children? Next slide. Marian Wright Edelman taught us that service is the rent we pay for being. It's the very purpose of life and not something that we do in our spare time. Next slide. We have many challenges to consider, both internally and externally. Climate change, real nutrition. Americans are obese. We have more diabetes than most people on the planet. Certainly at Amity, our chefs have addressed this through diet. People have lost weight, reversed diabetes, and learned how to rechange their relationship to food. We can all do that. Are we addressing sex trafficking, human trafficking? Are we finding ways to make family reconciliation more robust every year? Are we looking at immigration as our faculty and students have their families shattered with deportation? Are we thinking about those orphaned by COVID? Are we thinking about early childcare so that the single parents that work in our centers have places to bring their children? Are we looking at medically assisted treatment, adolescence? How are we addressing the issues and the problems that people bring with them when they come? People come to us and start working with us with large suitcases, and those suitcases have racism, homophobia, misogyny. How do we include and help people overcome those issues and buy into the concept of community as method? George touched on the issue of curriculum delivery. As we have mandated curriculums, are we finding creative ways to include the 8 essential elements and the basic assumptions that foster community as method? What are we doing in terms of our purchasing? Do we look at what we purchase so we can support climate-friendly, anti-racist corporations? Or do we just do what is convenient? How are we addressing the growing violence and those issues that are growing in our country? Next slide, please. Thomas Oz is kind of controversial. In 2007, the last book that was published was called The Medicalization of Everyday Life. So today, we have a spectacle of thousands in the criminal justice system that are mandated onto drugs as a condition of their release and parole. Some of them are returned to custody if they come off their medication. So we have to ask ourselves, are chemical restraints in the pharmaceutical industrial complex replacing the prison industrial complex? Is this yet another face of racism disguised as a concern and public safety, quote, for people's own good? There is a place for medication, of course. There is a way to utilize medication as a bridge to wholeness, yes. Are we addressing that? Are we questioning the massive mandated distribution? Are we having these discussions, or are we going blindly down the road as we did with mass incarceration? These are issues that we need to be discussing so we can move forward and do our very best. Next slide, please. It's a great book that was written a little while ago called Lead by Learning. And it is a key fit to the therapeutic community in so many ways. If we embrace community as method, if we embrace teaching in therapeutic community, we have to lead by learning about who we are serving. Learning openness, learning collective leadership, learning to question, learning critical reflection, learning to support the growth of others, learning democracy, hope, learning to analyze experience, and last but really first is building community. Next slide, please. Some years ago, Justice Douglas gave a talk and he said, as nightfall does not come at once, neither does oppression. In both instances, there's a twilight where everything remains seemingly unchanged. And it is in such a twilight that we must be most aware of the change in the air, however slight, lest we become unwitting victims of the darkness. And here comes the question again of erosion. We have to be awake to the erosion that can happen so easily. And we have to find ways, simple ways, to keep bolstering fidelity to the model. If you're in a prison and you have a robust TC and people stand online to get into the dining room, the chow hall, give them an assignment so that people are having a conversation with the person in front of them or the person behind them. If you have a short time to eat in a residential campus, a residential TC, have quotes on the table. We started a project over a year ago where every month we have print placemats, and each placemat has a quote depending on what commemorative month it is. Black History Month is famous people from the African American community. Women's Month, same thing, so that people can find different ways in the environment at all times to continue great discussion with one another and hear each other's opinions. Next slide, please. Critical reflection. This is just one from this book, Prescott and Brookfield. Focusing thinking on mission, purpose, and service by constantly asking questions about how ideas, decisions, and actions are tied to our desire to create a more humane, equal, and just society. Holding ourselves and others accountable. Next slide. Noting the gap between principles and practice. This happens to us all the time. By paying attention to what's not happening to promote the common good, by asking questions constantly about the connections between actions and principles. Next slide. Critical reflection, why it matters to hold leaders accountable to what's most important, to hold all of us accountable to what is most important. Next slide, please. Social justice, I suggest to you, is perhaps thinking about ourselves as we re-envision ourselves, thinking about ourselves leaning more towards social justice than a corporate entity. Not saying that we don't need a lot of those corporate structures, but are we a social justice entity? As places like Pepsi-Cola, who would have thought Pepsi, of all things, is changing their structure so that their highest level managers are being graded and assessed on their ability to pull together diverse teams, might we not return to that part of our roots and ensure that we are continuing on that particular march? Next slide, please. Courage, after all, is not being unafraid, but doing what needs to be done in spite of fear. James Farmer, founder of CORE. It is not knowledge that we lack. What is missing is the courage to understand what we know and draw conclusions. Sven Lindquist. We all know deep down that something more is required of us now. What it means to walk will be different for different people. I ask myself what I need to do to walk my walk with greater courage. Michelle Alexander, of course, the author of The New Jim Crow. Next slide, please. In the teaching community, we can look at empowerment and include how do we enroll faculty and students? What is their first impression? What is our orientation? We can think about our environment. Dr. De Leon has said that the first therapeutic intervention is the physical environment. What do our physical environments message to the people who walk into our centers? Education, from the Latin educare, to move forth. Are we moving people forth into a larger circle of truth? Emotional literacy and intelligence. And these four simple things, and there are many more, add to the empowerment of the individual, of the community, and to entheos, the God or the spirit within. Next slide, please. These are a few resources that we have found to be very useful. Obviously, anything and everything that George has ever done, books, articles, and videos. You can watch them many times, read it many times, and get something new out every time, and come up with creative ways to apply his work. And there are many more things as well. Next slide. Dolores Huerta tells us every moment is an organizing opportunity, every person a potential activist, every minute a chance to change the world. And this is true for the individuals, faculty, and students that come to us. We can all be potential activists in our own lives, in our families' lives, and in our communities' lives by utilizing community as the method. Next slide. And if you think perhaps that your voice doesn't matter, the Dalai Lama reminds us, if you think you're too small to make a difference, try sleeping with a mosquito. So, more than 50 years ago, I was sitting in a federal court at 17, about to be tried as an adult, and I did receive a well-constructed chance. It really wasn't on merit. It was probably because I was white and I looked a lot more like a judge's daughter than anybody else in the courtroom that day. I've chosen to remember that day since then, but I did take my chance. And if some of you are listening to this and you've gotten a chance, take it. Don't turn your back on it. Si se puede. I was taught not only that this day was the first day of the rest of my life, but more importantly, that life was a gift not to be wasted. So it's my hope that every single person that comes into a TC today will be able to say, decades from today, in the words of Violeta Parra, gracias a la vida que me ha dado tanto. So I will close today with the voices of some incarcerated women in a TC that no longer exists, who were engaged in community, who believed in community as a method, whose wish it was to be prodigal daughters, to be transformed and to be welcomed home. Thank you.
For me, I never had an opportunity to get a chance to be in a community or a program.
How much time have you done?
In the system, it'll be 13 years next month.
And how long have you used for?
27 years.
Do you ever wonder what it would have been like if somebody would have noticed when you were 14 or 15 or?
But if I got help the first time I went to prison, it would have been cool. I would have made it.
And did you go to prison for your addiction the first time you went to prison? Basically.
Basically, yes.
And there's always another reason, but
Selling
basically,
and then
yeah.
support my own habit by selling. That's what I did. But if I had the community or a program that was like this, structured this way as far as your behavior, I wouldn't have been here now.
Mom, you were always real angry. And you were always real abusive. And I never understood why. I always thought it was something that I had done wrong. And I could, as much as I tried, I could never make you happy. But I know now that it was because of how you were brought up. And if you could have changed it, you would have. And I want to break that. I don't want my kids to have to go through the pain that I went through. And I forgive you for everything that you did, because it wasn't your fault. And I know you love me.
County or here, when I have someone call me collect from here to home, I hear the backgrounds and I get so happy on the phone because I say, oh, they're coming from work, and I'm all excited, you know. But then when I'm home, you don't have that women-to-women bond anymore. Right. And you don't have the people coming up and, oh, it's so-and-so's birthday, do you want to participate? Or, you know, I don't have that when I'm out there. You know, I don't. But when you hear the background on the phone here, it does. You're not that warm feeling anymore, that you don't have it out there. I don't.
Just ran up on me all of a sudden. And I don't know where I'm at. I don't know what I'm feeling. I don't know how to fix it. And I just feel really out of control. And I don't know how to do time. I don't have the slightest clue what I'm doing.
It's like when I first came up in this mud, I told Tara, because we from the same county, and I was telling her, fuck that shit, I'm just gonna do time. And you know what I'm saying? I shouldn't have lied. God damn, I should have just turned myself in. She seen me from the stay. She seen me run on my stay. She seen me come back. And it was like, fuck that. And then she told me that I had to come to group and say all kind of bullshit. I told her, fuck that, I got the gift of gab. I'm just gonna lie. She said, you know they gonna know. No, they ain't. I'm just gonna lie. And another thing you kept telling me, you'll get that shit, you'll get it. No, I ain't. Fuck that. They just got you programmed.
No, they don't.
Shit. Last month, I got the shit. I'm serious as fuck. I'm serious as fuck. I'm like, you know, fuck, it's like different things. If you just be here, you'll get something out of it and shit. And I was like, fuck, I don't want to do that shit. I don't want to be doing pull-ups. I don't want to do none of that bullshit. I don't even want to share my story. The other day, they had to cut me off. You know?
Thank you very much for the presentations. Both of them were really, really great. Seep, did you want to do any closing remarks before I jump in here?
And thanks, Ed. I just wanted to express my sincere appreciation and gratitude both to George and to Naya for making time to be with us here today, and mention to everybody, I know there's a lot of Q&A in the chat. George and Naya both graciously agreed to stay with us, not only to hear the next set of panelists, but participate in the Q&A. I think that the remarks were right on time with everything that many of our programs and organizations are struggling with. So we appreciate that. And thanks, Ed, for giving me an opportunity to close out.
Thank you. Thank you. And Naya and George, thank you so much. I really appreciate, always love both of your all's presentations. I have been listening to them for the last 36 years of my career here in substance abuse treatment services. And I really appreciate it. So I want to thank both of our keynote speakers for their thorough presentation. It is truly humbling to learn from the utmost levels of TC expertise. We will now move into our TC panel presentations. Introducing each of our panelists will be TCA's Executive Director, Pat Clay. Pat has been with TCA for many years and has truly helped mold our provider agencies into the dynamic association that it is today. In a role as the Executive Director, Pat manages a host of board members, state association members, and associate members, and keeps TCA on the forefront of policy and advocacy for the substance use disorder field. I'm pleased to welcome Pat. She's done an amazing job, if you could imagine, trying to work with all CEO and executive directors from around the country, representing over 600 locations throughout the country. Yeah, it's truly a juggling act trying to deal with all of us. I have really enjoyed always working with Pat and her vision and the work that she's done for us nationally. Pat, you are on.
Thanks, Ed, for your kind introduction. Good afternoon, good morning. Again, my name is Pat Clay, and I'm the Executive Director of Treatment Communities of America, and I've been in that position for the last 14 years. As you may know, TCA is a nonprofit, member-led professional association located in Washington, D.C. TCA members are community-based substance use disorder treatment providers. Our mission is to ensure access to the full continuum of care for individuals and families affected by substance use disorders and mental health issues. I am honored to lead you into the next section of the webinar, where you will hear from several panelists about the various populations that they serve. Our first panel discussion will focus on adult substance use disorder treatment. The presenter is Cecilia Denmark from Bridges International in Orlando, Florida. Our second panel discussion is on adolescent treatment and will be done by Deborah Pantin and John Venza of Outreach, located in New York. For our third presentation, we will hear from Dr. Vitka Eisen of Health Right 360, located in San Francisco, California, on family and children. And for our last but not least presentation, we will hear from Gregg Dockins of Gateway Foundation, located in Chicago, Illinois, on the topic of corrections in criminal justice populations. Again, please put any questions that you may have in the Q&A section on your screen. And at the end of the panel presentations, I will try to read all the questions that have been submitted. If you can please indicate who your question is for so I can make sure that it gets to the right person. Again, this webinar will be recorded and you will be able to access it shortly after the webinar is finished. We will place the webinar on the TCA website for you to access whenever you want. Let me now introduce our first panelist, Cecilia Denmark. Cecilia Denmark is an experienced correctional manager and consultant with more than 40 years in the criminal justice and behavioral health fields. She began her career as a correctional officer with the Florida Department of Corrections and was promoted through the ranks to assistant warden. She also worked in the substance use disorder treatment field as a facility director of community residential therapeutic programs with Bridges of America, where she was promoted through the organization to vice president and chief operating officer. Ms. Denmark currently serves as a consultant for Bridges International, Bridges of America, where she works on their legislative agenda to generate ongoing awareness and continued SUD treatment funding to the Florida legislature for substance use disorder treatment programs operated by the organization. Bridges International serves adult men, women, and their families with programs, educational, vocational, chaplaincy, and employment opportunities that lead to successful transition upon the release from incarceration. I now would like to turn it over to Cecilia Denmark.
Thank you, Pat, for the wonderful introduction. And I also want to thank Dr. DeLeon and Naya for your continued work in expanding our knowledge of the effectiveness and relevance of the therapeutic community. Congratulations on those awesome presentations, and welcome everyone. Next slide, please. Bridges International provides substance use disorder treatment, transitional and reentry services in community residential settings, utilizing the therapeutic community model concepts. We have programs in Florida, Alabama, New York, and Canada, serving adult, female, and male criminal justice populations. Our treatment models include therapeutic communities, outpatient, and aftercare services for individuals who are currently incarcerated, post-release offenders, and court-ordered probation clients. Our treatment models have proven to be effective in reducing substance use behavior for adult populations that we serve. We specialize in addressing individual inmate and probation or substance use treatment needs in a community environment while maintaining safety, security, quality services, and broadening treatment service delivery. Our programs have been successful in reducing recidivism rates for our participants. Today, I will be focusing on the continued success of our community residential centers, even with the many challenges that we face. Our scope of services are still the ones that we originally started with: substance use treatment, employability skills, family reunification, and other services that enhances an inmate's successful reintegration back into society. The program model that we use now, we once had individuals in the program that had a minimum of 18 to 24 months. But now our clients come to us with a minimum of 6 months to 12 months. Next slide, please. Our current program design consists of 4 months participation in the substance use outpatient treatment modules that include counseling and group sessions utilizing evidence-based curriculums. Clients participate in one 45-minute individual counseling session monthly and one 60 to 90-minute process group twice weekly. We also offer educational and vocational as well as employment skills during the treatment phase. Upon successful completion of our outpatient treatment and program plan requirements, the client is recommended and approved for participation in the work release component of the program for the remainder of his or her sentence. Our programs are licensed, and we focus on a holistic approach to treatment. Individual assessments are conducted using the Ohio Risk Assessment System supplemental reentry tool, and each person is an active participant in their treatment. Our curriculum for the outpatient substance use program has been developed using the Texas Christian University manuals and the Matrix Intensive Outpatient Treatment Curriculum as a tool used by our clinicians. We are committed to engaging each client in actively preparing themselves to participate and address the issues of treatment, life skills, education, family reunification, parenting, mentoring, and community linkages, just to name a few. Next slide, please. At Bridges, our program addressed the 6 pillars of successful treatment, transition, and reentry. We focus on substance use treatment and aftercare, education and vocation needs, employment and financial stability, spirituality, family reunification, and housing. Next slide, please. The Bridges team has designed our programs to address and/or eliminate the many barriers that returning criminal justice populations are faced with. We know that our returning population has a problem with housing, transportation, access to adequate health care, financial stability, food and clothing needs, and securing identification cards. We have been able to accomplish all of this through our innovative program, appropriate and adequate counseling and treatment, through our collaborative community partnerships, through our alumni and other support groups, and by providing the work release opportunity in our facilities. Next slide, please. We have seen a dramatic increase of individuals entering our programs that have co-occurring disorders. They are entering not only with a substance use disorder, but also with at least one mental health disorder. Next slide, please. At Bridges International, we recognize the importance of community partnerships and linkages to have successful programs. For more than 40 years, we have continued to expand our community networks and partnerships to provide the needed overlay and support services for our clients and their families. Next slide, please. We are proud of the services offered that also benefit the families attached to our clients. In our holistic treatment approach, we focus on family development, parent and caretaker involvement, family day celebrations that are designed specifically to engage positive family interactions. We also have graduation celebrations from our many programs that we offer, and chaplaincy services, just to name a few. Next slide, please. To actively prepare our clients to be self-sufficient as returning citizens in their communities, we offer several vocational trainings and certifications in conjunction with our community partners, such as construction certifications, general industry certifications, commercial driver's license, forklift, and our Serve Safe food handlers program. Next slide, please. We also focus on the educational needs of our clients by providing general education instructors in each of our programs. And we also have virtual education instruction. Next slide, please. The employment development process in our program is facilitated by our program specialists, employment specialists, who assist the clients with resume writing, interviewing techniques, completing job applications, assisting the clients with weekly budgeting skills, and instructions on desirable work habits and attributes in the work environment. Next slide, please. The employment development process also deals with job readiness. We assist our clients with financial assistance to assure that they have the tools, uniforms, and anything necessary to perform the jobs that they have secured in our communities. Next slide, please. Gainful employment for our clients is a major step in the continuum of successful treatment and counseling on their journey of recovery and living substance-free. Next slide, please. Bridges International is committed to assisting our clients in their treatment needs, helping them to live a life free of substance use, promoting a continuum of care upon entry into a bridge facility that continues far beyond successful release into our communities. Next slide, please. When our clients are successful in their treatment, they return to our communities as productive and contributing citizens. These are just a few photos of the happy faces, the family gatherings, the things that we participate in to keep our system going of treatment. We treat the whole person, the families that are also attached to that whole person. I want to thank you for allowing me to share Bridges' TC and work release program model. Thank you for being a part of this training today.
Thank you, Cecilia. Our next presentation is on adolescence and will be done by Deb Pantin and John Venza. Joining Outreach as president and CEO in 2018, Deborah Pantin has over 30 years of experience in the fields of addiction, mental health treatment, housing, homeless services, and healthcare. Beginning as a practitioner, Ms. Pantin eventually emerged into organizational development and leadership. Throughout her career, she has been instrumental in establishing residential and outpatient substance use disorder and mental health services, ambulatory detoxification services, and a multitude of housing and special projects. Leading agency-wide changes and managing organizational transitions are the hallmark of Ms. Pantin's experience. She participates in various national, state, and local boards. Deborah's most recent position was CEO at VIP Community Services, a not-for-profit organization that provides comprehensive social services in the Bronx, located in New York, through residential care, outpatient counseling, shelter care, medical and mental health services, housing, and more. Prior to joining VIP Community Services in 2018, Ms. Pantin served as a Chief Operating Officer of Palladia, formerly Project Run. At Palladia, she worked for 25 years, directing program and operational services, which collectively served 26,000 clients annually, with a staff of 500 employees and an annual budget of $50 million. Ms. Pantin has been a driving force in educating her team and staff in healthcare reform. She has exceptional human service management experience and command of the critical policy issues of our times. Ms. Pantin is a member of the TCA Executive Committee, where she is the committee chair of training and clinical practice. Next, I'll introduce John Venza. John Venza is a New York State licensed clinical social worker and licensed mental health counselor who has been working with children, adolescents, and families for the past 39 years. Mr. Venza is the president of Adolescent Residential Services for Outreach Development Corporation, where he provides clinical and administrative oversight to the largest residential adolescents substance use disorder treatment programs in the downstate New York region. Outreach is a nonprofit organization licensed by the New York State Office of Alcohol and Substance Abuse Services and offers evidence-based treatment and training services to the greater New York metropolitan area. Mr. Venza is well known for his expertise in practice with adolescents and young adults in New York City, especially Long Island. Additionally, he is the author of 5 graduate-level courses on adolescence. Mr. Venza maintains a private therapy practice where he specializes in parent education and family-centered treatment for adolescents and young adults. Mr. Venza is a member of the new legislative appointed opioid task force and serves as the co-chair of Suffolk County's Community Solutions and heads a subcommittee for school outreach, to name a few. Welcome, Debbie and John.
Thank you, Pat. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you all for joining us. And again, much thanks to our, presentation speakers today. You've done a wonderful job setting up this panel, I think, for a wonderful introduction to the services that we provide here in the United States. I'll start by giving some overview of outreach and our history into this work, and then John would, we'll tag team a little bit. So outreach really began working in this area of addiction treatment and TC work with adolescents. Actually, we started as an outreach facility into the field, doing outreach into the community, hence our name. And the two pictures you see here is our residential sites for the adolescent population. And you'll see more of it as we go along. Next slide. The outreach program for adolescents, when we say adolescents here, one of the things John and I want to be clear about upfront is that we're talking about ages 12 to 17, because I think throughout the world, adolescents are determined differently and decided differently. But for us here in the US, it's primarily 12 to 17. This is a map of New York, as you can see on the left there, and to the far right of the screen, that's Long Island. So our program we wanted to give you some visual locations of where our programs are. Some of it is in Long Island, and some of our programs are in the New York City area. Of the sites that you see there with the stars are the locations where we provide adolescent services. And out of the 5 of those, 2 of those are the residential therapeutic community location sites. Next slide. Okay, on this slide, we want to tell you a little bit about the demographics around the clients that we serve in our adolescent population. As you can see here, most of the folks that we service are males. We also, our racial ethnic breakdown, we would say probably about 56% of them are minority population, and the remaining are about, white Caucasian folks that we service. The substance of choice that most of our patients tend to come in using, and our students, and they're literally students, as you will hear John talk in a little bit, they use cannabis. With the second drug that folks tend to use coming in is alcohol. Then we wanted to give you a little glimpse of the some of the co-occurring disorders that we also tend to deal with most of our patients. And it's anywhere ranging, as you see from this list, of major depression, some dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder, some bipolar, some anxiety as well. Of course, dealing with kids, there is always the question around attention deficit disorder, and of course, mood disorders. In terms of the trauma symptomology that we tend to see more, at least 63% non-symptomatic, but we do pick it up in a lot of the original assessment and diagnosis that we do, and with about a 36.8% that are symptomatic. Next slide. We wanted to also give you a little bit again of the continuum of services when we talk about the residential services there as you go up those steps, so to speak. So we have some outpatient services. We have also enhanced outpatient services that specialized in different populations. And also we have an alternative recovery high school that we do in New York City, in the Brooklyn area. And we have some day rehab services as well. And of course, we have the residential residential service sites, and then we move into the community resident services. I saw a question in the chat, and I hope John and I will be able to address some of it as we go along. Definitely, the services here in our residential site is only with the kids, but we do service the parents as well, but not in our settings. They are separated temporarily during this process, but in the clinical aspect of what John is going to describe for you, he's going to give you a good flavoring of how we work with the kids and we work with the parents at the same time. John?
Thanks, Deb. And thank you to everybody involved in putting the conference together and having me here today. So I guess if we could just advance the slide, please. And, real briefly, I think it's important when we talk about adolescence, like Debbie said, let's talk about specifically the age group of adolescents. We're dealing with the school age adolescents, right? The middle school, high school. And need I say more? Middle school and high school, a whole heck of a lot is happening. From a developmental perspective, when we look at the adolescent, the main piece to this slide that I'd like folks to kind of take away from this is if you look at the significance or radius of significant relationships, it's peers, it's their friends, right? And much to the chagrin of many a parent, it's kind of like their friends are their gods, and parents are whatever the friends say go. But it's developmentally appropriate. It's what should be happening. And why this is so important is when you're looking at the fact that their peers are so important, the affinity, the degree of affinity for an adolescent model of a therapeutic or treatment community is extremely high, because we've heard throughout the presentation today, community as method. And essentially, the community is that continued assessment and feedback loop that the community gives to the TC participant, or in this case, the adolescent, about their behavior and about their participation in the community. So I think, when we look at this one, you talk about developmentally appropriate and what a great treatment match this model is. It couldn't be any better for teenagers. Next slide, please. And one more, please. Next slide. So essentially, why are peers so important? Well, this is where predominantly all their learning is occurring, by comparisons. These are their kids, their friends are basically the people they spend the most time with. They're with them for hours in school, after school, whether in a structured activity or a non-structured activity. And it's where basically they get most of their support, most of their empathy. Listen, it's important because whenever I speak to parents and do workshops, I let them know, Mom, Dad, picture it this way. The friends have been moved to the front row of the play during adolescence. You're still in the auditorium. You've just been moved back a few rows. But the good news is, in adulthood, you'll move back to that front row again. So I think it's important to recognize that this is, again, developmentally appropriate behavior. Next slide, please. So essentially, kids want to be accepted by their peers. It's so important for them to be accepted by their friends, right? Maybe more so than any of the other life stages in the life cycle. Next slide, please. But there's a tipping point. What happens when kids want to be accepted so badly, but they aren't able to achieve that through pro-social behaviors, such as playing an instrument or a sport or some other club, and they don't achieve that acceptance. So that wanting to be accepted turns into kind of a needing of acceptance, and unfortunately, when kids enter that needing to be accepted, some dysphoria follows. I think the self-esteem and the self-concept takes a huge hit. And that's when we begin to see kids going down the path of risk behaviors, including substance use, right? So wanting to be accepted and needing to be accepted. And that's the next slide, please. The adolescent TC becomes huge, because when things bottom out to the point where kids, the wheels are wobbling and falling off the cart, they need an intervention that very often removes them temporarily for a treatment episode away from their communities, away from their schools, and away from the families, and immersing them amongst other peers and other young people. So the adolescent therapeutic community really gives that opportunity for kids to either learn or relearn, right? Habilitation or rehabilitation about the pro-social ways to become accepted and belong. And, you know, it's amazing because they walk through the door and on the very first day, there's the 15-year-old running around with a clipboard doing a pop count. And suddenly they realize they're not in Kansas anymore, right? They realize they're someplace different. And what really starts to happen is it really flips the script around when they were prior to coming in, went down the road where negative behavior, risk behavior, substance use all became what was accepted and promoted by the peer group they became part of. Now we're taking the very same developmentally appropriate thing, their peers, their peer group, and flipping the script where positive behavior, positive values, the right living becomes what's in vogue, becomes what's popular, becomes what we want the kids to ascend to. So that dynamic works really well. And next slide, please. One more slide, please. Okay, so, you know, peers as role models. I mean, when we talk about two fundamental pillar pieces of the therapeutic community, right? Community as method and peers as role models. What about when the peers become somebody your own age, somebody younger than you? And suddenly the light bulb goes on and kids really begin to kind of see their peers. It's also a wonderful place where when they begin to listen to other kids in group that call them on their stuff. You know, they've tuned out and turned off many of the adults in their lives. The last thing they need is another surrogate parent, so to speak. And I think that's also where the staff in the adolescent TC learn to shrink themselves. The we-they dichotomy between staff and resident, you know, gets shifted. And peers as role models, so where it starts to become, in their language, a cool thing to become somebody up on the structure. So I think it's critically important. The final word I want to throw in there, and I could go on for a long time, as folks know, around adolescents and therapeutic community, but the final thing I want as a takeaway is remember the life stage. They're teenagers. You know, they haven't forgotten during the 7, 8, 9, 10 months they're in treatment that their friends are out at the park, out at the beaches, out doing teenage things. Treatment has to be innovative, creative, and fun for young people. And we can't forget that. So that's where the multimodal therapies come in. Debbie's going to speak in a moment about some of the things that we offer. But things, you know, things like drumming circles and art therapy and creating, you know, sober socialization outings, right? Critically important to make treatment fun. Treatment is hard work, but it can also be a lot of fun for young people. And we can't lose sight of that because we talk about engagement and retention. You know, very few adolescents enter treatment with intrinsic motivation to change. So we've got to make it an enticing thing that keeps them hooked in long enough for us to get that flip in treatment. So, and just a little note on the parent piece, since Debbie kind of threw it my way as well. You know, the parents aren't being treated in the building, as she mentioned, but we put the parents on what we call a parallel process of treatment, where they're going through an intense process through groups and participation. And our parents are involved sometimes twice a week up at the facility in groups with other parents, activities with other parents. And it's critically important when we eventually bring them together for the therapy with their kids, that we've kind of given them the same stuff that the kids are getting by participating in the therapeutic community throughout their time in treatment. So I'm going to stop there and volley it back over to Deb, who's going to bring us home on this.
Okay, thanks, John. So the other piece John and I wanted to share with you, there are just 3 other quick pieces. And that is, I think Naya talked about it really beautifully in her piece, where she talked about, you know, the staff that works, you know, with the students in this realm. And we wanted to give you a sense of what kinds of staff in terms of discipline that work, you know, with the students. And you can see from this list, it's a really wide range of staff. So there are licensed social workers, there are mental health counselors, there are marriage and family therapists, as well as John just pointed out, doing a lot of the family work when the parents join us. There are credentialed here in the States, particularly in New York. We have credentialed substance abuse counselors, as we call CASACs for short, or CASACTs, case managers. So it's really, when you look at it, it's a community of staff that really work together collaboratively to bring the services and bring the intervention. As you know, as we talk about community as method, we pay very close attention to that community of staff that come together. And someone may have the question out there, what age group? Well, they vary in age group. We pay very close attention to that these are individuals who are able to relate to the young individuals, as well as individuals who are a little bit older and could be role models. So we pay a lot of attention to that staffing that works with the students. And in terms of ongoing training, we do a lot of
John, I think Deb may
Yeah,
have
may have
frozen.
froze. Yeah.
If you
Yeah.
could jump in there, that would be great. Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, I think just if I could just, I'll just jump in. She's back. Here, she's back. Okay.
You got it? Go, John.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I had Deb. You had froze for a second, so I was just jumping in, but you're back. So.
Okay, good.
Right.
Motivational interviewing, cognitive behavioral therapy, seeking safety, and 7 challenges. Okay, next slide. Okay, the next to last thing John and I wanted to share with you was a little bit about COVID. You might be asking how we fared during this time period working with the adolescent population during COVID. We have to say, surprisingly to us, it was not as difficult as we thought it could have been. The kids were extremely resilient. They were very much, again, used to being together and working together. A lot of families, you might have asked, well, did they come and take their kids out and take them home? No, they did not. They actually preferred the kids to stay with us. They thought that was the safest place. The family stayed involved, and the format that we used was very beneficial in that we used telehealth. We did video conferencing, and that allowed the kids to continue, to connect with their family members. John, you want to add anything real quickly before we go to the video?
Yeah, I think with the COVID piece, I think remember the teenagers went through what the teenagers that were going during COVID at home were going through months earlier. When they had to go into residential treatment, they had to say goodbye to their friends and peers at school and in the community. They already made that separation. While during COVID, kids at home were really going through changes because they were being isolated to home isolation and couldn't see their friends. So our kids were way ahead in that process. And they also had their peers or their family in treatment, to kind of surrogate that process, during COVID. I think my last note I would say is whenever I've trained new staff and folks coming in to work with adolescents in therapeutic community, I remind them that there are 3 critical elements to working with teenagers, especially this age of teenagers. One is your clinical work. The second is being part of part educator. But the third most important is being a really good frustrated actor, being able to shrink yourselves so you can allow yourselves to engage and dig in and get on that level then for all the meaningful clinical insights and education you have for them to take hold. So thanks for everybody.
Thank you, Deb and John. Our third panelist is Dr. Vitka Eisen. Vitka is a president and chief executive officer of HealthRight 360, a healthcare provider for very low income and otherwise marginalized Californians. With over 30 years of experience in human services, Vitka has dedicated her career to supporting people in communities struggling with addiction and incarceration through the provision of integrated, compassionate, and relevant care. Since being appointed to her current role in 2010, Vitka has led HealthRight 360 through a series of mergers, growing the organization to serve over 30,000 people annually. A frequent speaker on innovative practices, Vitka is the secretary and treasurer of the board of directors of the National Council for Behavioral Health, the Vice President of the Board of Directors of the California Association of Drug and Alcohol Program Executives, and the former President and member of the Board of Directors of the California Council of Community Behavioral Health Agencies. Vitka earned an MSW from San Francisco State University and a doctorate from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Vitka is a former injection heroin user. She participated in substance use disorder treatment over 30 years ago at the agency she now leads. I'd like to welcome Vitka Eisen.
Thank you. Thanks, Pat. And thank you, everybody on the panel. It's been really quite amazing. I've learned a great deal, and I feel honored to be with this amazing group of folks. And I just want to get in conversation with all of you. This is why Zoom makes me sad. But hey, listen, this gave us an opportunity for like 400 of us to get together in the middle of a pandemic and talk about residential treatment for the people that we care about. So the topic of the conversation, title slide says women and children, but I am going to talk in general about gender as well as family care. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about like the place from whence we came. Treatment programs, so this is kind of the beginning about gender. Treatment programs, residential treatment programs, therapeutic communities were historically co-ed, and they were all overwhelmingly male, and they were often patriarchal in a really traditional sense. By that I mean they were historically led by men who served in a father-like figure for the community. The participation rates for women in residential treatment have been lower for a variety of reasons. And some of them are the barriers to care that I'm going to talk about in further slides. But sometimes low participation rate reinforces low participation rates, insofar as when you have a minority of women, if you have a house of 100 people and there's 75 men and 25 women, women are outnumbered, and it tends to reinforce some of the challenges and issues that women coming into treatment face. So when you have a house where women are so outnumbered, it tends to actually reinforce keeping the numbers of clients low. At Health Right 360, and some of you, I've recognized some of the names of the attendees. Some of you may know us as Walden House, and we are Walden House. At Walden House, at one point separated the men and women into treatment, and whereas we'd only been able to have half the house full of, less than half, 25% of the clients were women in the house, once we separated the men and the women, more women stayed in treatment. We had a much higher participation rate amongst the women. So having low participation rates of women sometimes drives low participation rates, again, for a variety of reasons. Next slide, please. So there are definitely social factors and barriers to care for women. And those, of course, are shame and stigma. Most people who struggle with substance use experience some kinds of shame and stigma. For women, those are often reinforced by being kind of failures as women, failures as mothers, and just not meeting up to any kind of social expectations of what women should be. Often women have family responsibilities that have prevented them from coming into treatment, residential treatment. That includes not just care for children, but care for vulnerable elders, caring for their parents. They're more likely to be the caretakers in their family. And a high percentage of women are trauma survivors, which also drove some of the women leaving treatment earlier. Some studies have shown that up to 80% of women who have substance use disorder have trauma histories. And residential treatment programs have not always been conducive to trauma survivors' sense of safety. Next slide, please. So a big barrier to treatment used to be being pregnant, and in many locations and places it still is being pregnant or having little children. Up until the 1980s, there were few residential treatment programs that admitted pregnant women and women with children. Women with children and pregnant women were seen as very high risk, and programs didn't have an ability to do so. And one of the things that I'll touch on a couple of times in my brief talk is that, you know, in the United States, there are barriers to care that are kind of created through funding mechanisms and structures that prevent us from doing the things that we know are the right things to do and that we know are the best things to do. And so being able to house women and children together in treatment was difficult, actually, not just because of any stigma or prejudice associated with that, but it's also difficult from kind of funding and licensing perspectives, which again, I'll touch on. There has been an increase in the number of programs for pregnant and postpartum women, residential treatment programs. And in part, that is because there's been some funding that is federal funding that has supported that in particular. A recent national survey from 2015 found that 23% of residential treatment facilities across the nation had programs specifically for pregnant and postpartum women. And within those programs, women were actually offered, 24% of the women were on methadone, 44% of the women were on buprenorphine. But nevertheless, there are still very significant gaps in the availability of treatment services benefiting pregnant and postpartum women. Next slide, please. Some of the things that we have done in modifying therapeutic community to make the programs more conducive and safer for women have been the recognition of trauma and creating safety in the community. We recognize trauma. We're attentive. That means we're attentive to boundaries for clients. We're attentive to relationships. Women often operate in a much more relational way, and so we're attentive to that. We help develop coping skills. And we also recognize that women have a different a gendered path to their substance use, which are often related to partners and families. And additionally, a high percentage of women with substance use disorder have co-occurring mental illness, which we also attend to in treatment. Next slide, please. So there are, within the kind of the bounds and the walls and community we create in a therapeutic community, we also do deploy essential services for women and evidence-based care. Those services include Seeking Safety, which is a evidence-based, many of you are familiar with, an evidence-based program for people who have experienced trauma and have substance use disorder. We integrate MAT services, medication-assisted treatment, within all of our programs for women as well as for men. And we do so because we view it as medicine in the same way as that we would look at making sure that our clients with diabetes had access to insulin, and our clients with high blood pressure had medications to help manage that. We look at medication-assisted treatment as a part of that. And it is the path for some people, it isn't the path for others, but we want to make sure it is available. And there's a lot of research that supports that. Obviously, we offer parenting support for mothers. We also offer parenting support for fathers, and we use a gender-responsive curriculum for both. And very important for treating women, obviously, from the very beginning is linkages to care, making sure that there's, from the very beginning, that we're thinking about their housing needs on the other side, safety needs in terms of relationships, income stability, employment, their social supports. And then throughout our programs, if the program itself isn't specifically a women-only program, we always offer women-only groups and or specific services within the larger program for women. I know that Naya touched on, I'm sorry, next slide, please. I know that Naya beautifully touched on some of the intersections of race and gender and the challenges that some of the residents we serve in treatment face. I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about some of those. So Black women experience maternal health disparities. This has been supported by, this information is supported by research. Pregnancy-related deaths are 3 times higher for Black women than white women, and 2 times higher for American Indian women than white women. Infant mortality rates are more than 2 times higher for Black and American Indian infants. And women of color, also in terms of incarceration, they make up a disproportionate share of incarcerated women. Studies have also shown that women of color struggling with substance use disorder are more likely to be reported to Child Protective Services and more likely to have their children taken away than white women under similar circumstances. So you can imagine that this is an enormous barrier to care for women of color seeking treatment for their substance use disorder. If you know that you're more likely to lose your kids, that's definitely going to be a barrier to care. And in addition, women of color are overrepresented in the U.S. jails and prisons. There is a tremendous amount of shame associated with incarceration for many people, but it's particularly true for women. I have worked in the prison system, as many of the folks on this attending this event. I've worked in the prison system, and I've talked lengthy conversations with incarcerated women who talked about feeling as they left prison or as they prepared to leave prison that, like, if I went to the store, everybody would know that they could just tell by looking at them that they had been in prison. There's a tremendous amount of shame associated with that. And so the programs have to be prepared to help women feel they have a right to care and a right to be in community and a right to have health and safety, and have to address the issues, the traumatization of incarceration itself as part of treatment and program. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about sexuality. Programs must proactively address sexuality, including dealing with sex between clients. I'm going to talk a little bit about this on another slide. But in this case in particular, I want to talk about creating safety for LGBTQI clients. As a program that's based in San Francisco, I think Health Right Walden House has always been really very welcoming of LGBTQI clients. That is not always the case for people who are in residential treatment. And so it's important to have special, even when we worked in prisons, we had special groups for people who identified as LGBTQI, having special affinity groups for clients, making sure that staff are well trained and treat people with respect, making sure that the other clients and community treat each other with respect is an important part of creating a safe and thriving treatment community for the people we work with. Next slide, please. At Health Right 360, we're probably one of the first organizations to have a specific treatment program within our larger residential treatment community, a specific program welcoming transgender men and women into treatment. And to make that successful, we had to make sure that we did a lot of training with staff and with our resident community as well, to make sure that people were housed appropriately, they're housed with their identified gender, they're housed, that people use the appropriate gender pronouns, and that people treat trans men and women with respect and care. Our studies have shown that transgender individuals have high rates of alcohol use, as well as other drug use, and they have more severe substance use than when compared to transgender people. In examining disparity between transgender and non-transgender individuals, studies have noted discrimination between trans-specific discrimination, transphobia, gender abuse, and abuse from religious groups, and people's substance use. So prolonged exposure to prejudice and discrimination experienced by members of minority and marginalized group is associated with adverse health and psychological outcomes and health risk behaviors. So it's critically important that our communities, if we really want to be a community, that we're welcoming people who are non-binary, gendered, and or trans men and women. Next slide, please. I know this is a little bit outside, but I just want to touch on it. I want to talk a little bit about harm reduction, because I really look at harm reduction as kind of some of the new challenges and new frontiers in residential treatment. And in specific, I'm going to talk a little bit about sex workers and safety and stigma. And so drug-dependent women who are sex workers have poor outcomes from drug treatment services compared with other service users. And some of this is a result of the trauma experienced by women who are sex workers and having been experienced being sex trafficked. And so they tend to have poor outcomes. And so we have to address in program safety and stigma associated with sex work, and use some of the interventions we've used historically have not necessarily been as effective. So we might have to really make sure that we focus very specifically on trauma. And also, again, I'm a big fan, a big supporter of affinity groups in treatment, where we have specialty groups for people based on, even that while they may be in an integrated community, that we have specialty groups that address specifically issues of race for our clients of color. We need to do the same for clients who are sex workers and address specifically some of the challenges and experience of their lives as having been sex workers. I also want to talk about just harm reduction in general and working with ambivalence. So, most of the people that we work with in treatment are people who are coming to us with a great deal of ambivalence. And which means that like they may be highly motivated for treatment, and when they first come in, and then they deal with some stressors, they're less motivated, and they may have returns to drug use. So how do we, as residential treatment communities that are committed to the safety of everybody who comes to us, how are we as organizations really committed to caring for people through their ambivalence, which may mean that they've had a return to drug use? How do we address that, particularly in this time, in this point in time, where the number of opioid overdose deaths are at an all-time high, the highest they've been, 93,000, I think, for the last year. 93,000 people died of overdose deaths. So how do we manage people's return to drug use and yet keep our treatment communities safe? I think that is an important consideration. Would love to have a longer conversation with all of you about that in the future. So next slide, please. Yeah, I'm only talking about families. So I want to talk about families in kind of several different ways. And so I'll start with family behavior therapy. So family behavior therapy is an evidence-based intervention that has demonstrated positive results in both adults and adolescents. And it's aimed at addressing substance use problems, as well as conduct disorders, child mistreatment, depression, family conflict. And it is really about dealing with, it's a little bit of cognitive behavioral therapy, it's some community management, and it really is about providing care for an entire family. And it is one of the few kind of NIDA approved evidence-based interventions for working with families in treatment. I also want to talk a little bit about couples therapy. So, one of the biggest challenges, I think, for historically in the therapeutic community is like dealing with clients engaged in romantic relationships with each other, or even relationships on the outside. I certainly remember early years in working in programs where, people really saw relationships as the kind of thing that pulled people out of care. So I want to challenge us to think about, what if we looked at that really different? What if we looked at sex and sexuality and the people who might connect in program in a different way? And instead of being harmful to the community, what if we worked with them as couples? Because eventually people are going to leave and they're going to be in a relationship. And so how do we want to think about that so that we can help prepare people for probably one of the biggest stressors they're going to face when they leave? And that is, how do you like stay off drugs and be in a relationship with people and deal with like the stressors of relationships? And so when we worked in the prisons, we had, particularly in the women's programs, we had lots of women who were entered into relationships with each other while they were in prison. And so we just found we had to deal with that directly. And instead of dealing with it like you're breaking the rules, which in prison actually there were, but instead of dealing with like you're breaking the rule, let's talk about what's going on, and let's deal with it in a very direct way. And I think in my mind, that is really how you work in community and create kind of sustaining treatment communities. And finally, I want to say, as I think I touched on earlier, in the United States, the way that treatment is funded and regulations around licensing and treatment have prevented us from developing common sense care, which means we may think it is a good idea that we want to serve families in care, that we want to provide services, a full range of services. But in this country, that has not been an option. And it's not an option because of how treatment is funded. And so recently, a bill was passed in the US Congress, the Family First Prevention and Services Act. And that bill will allow us to provide much more kind of holistic family care. And, typically we look at family care as operating kind of along a continuum, meaning, for who are we treating? We're treating the parent. And then that's our main focus of treatment. And in doing so, we hope that their ability to be parents is strengthened. But when we really think about it along a continuum, we really would love to focus on family-centered treatment. And we believe that this new bill will allow us to get there, which means that we would provide that everybody in a family, whoever is in care with us, that everybody in care with us is part of who we are responsible for and how we work within community, that those families are whether they live in community or not, they're part of our treatment community. And so each of the individuals in the family actually receives a plan of care and receives both individual services and family services as well as community. And so with that, I hope I've left you with some things to think about. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Vitka. Next, we will hear from Gregg Dockins. Gregg Dockins serves as a division president of correction services for the Gateway Foundation. He is responsible for all Gateway correctional treatment services, which currently includes contracts for over 12,000 beds in prisons and community correction programs across the United States. Gateway currently operates programs in Delaware, Florida, Michigan, Missouri, New Jersey, Texas, and Wyoming. Mr. Dockins has been licensed as an SUD counselor for over 30 years, and most of his experience has been focused on managing modified TC programs for clients caught in the intersection of substance use disorder and criminal justice system. Mr. Dockins also serves as the second vice president of TCA. Welcome, Gregg.
Thank you, Pat. Greetings from Chicago, Illinois, the headquarters of the Gateway Foundation. I'm humbled to be part of this esteemed group of presenters. I'll try to wrap us up strong. I think, the beauty of my presentation is that I'm building off the strength and the information and the foundation that was laid from all the prior presentations. Gateway Foundation was founded over 50 years ago, one of the legacy TC agencies. We were a founding member of TCA back in the 70s, and really been tried to stay at the forefront of service delivery, taking the TC model from the past and into the present. One of the first things that comes to mind when we talk about the correctional population is why corrections? Why corrections in TCs? And so the original foundational purpose of that stems from the reality of the epidemic of incarceration in this country. And so one of the things that I wanted to lay as the framework for this presentation is that depending on the research and study that you look at, when this country criminalized not just drugs in the war on drugs in the early 80s, but criminalized the addictive lifestyle and those who suffer from SUDs. And so as a result of that, there was a quadrupling of the prison population between 1980 and the early 2000s. Tragically, this country is responsible for more people behind bars than any other country in the world. One of the stark realities about this population that we serve is that, depending on the research that you read, anywhere from 65 to 80% of the population that's incarcerated in the United States is there because of substance use disorders or crimes related to alcohol and drugs, and that is the big travesty. And so, one of the second things is that you should know that in our country, if you take the incarcerated population, you do nothing except house them until their sentence ends, and then you release them back into the community. It is very visible in the literature that 2/3 of that population will be back in prison within 3 years. And so, the proliferation of treatment programs in correctional institutions was at a necessity. We'll never be able to build enough prisons to take care of the drug problem. And fortunately, none of the prisons we build will actually produce the change in individuals that rebuilds families. And that's the purpose of the TC, to teach right living, to use the community as method, and doing that in a context like a prison system is crucial. If you go to the next slide, please. What my presentation will not do is tell you how to build a prison TC. One of the things that you have to do with an agency like Gateway is, how do I take 50 years of history and cram it into a 15-minute presentation? So what I've chosen to do is really maybe reframe the presentation as, what are the practical considerations for taking a modified TC into a correctional environment, and how do you have the biggest benefit and for both the clients and frankly the institution and the funding entity or the Department of Corrections. And so our customers are obviously those suffering from SUDs that are in incarcerated settings, but our customers are also the funders and the departments of corrections. And so part of what we want to do is to show them that therapeutic communities in and of themselves are an evidence-based practice. They certainly have been proven to show, as George talked previously and Naya talked, and all of the presenters have experience in the criminal justice setting, to know that TCs in prisons are the best, most effective intervention for the intersection of criminality and substance use disorders. And so if we do that, one of the first things that you have to do when entering the context of a TC in a prison that we have learned over our 40 some years of history as an agency of providing programs in correctional settings is finding out how do we bring together and create a nexus between the goals of the institution and the goals of the environment of a prison with the goals of the TC and the strength of what the rehabilitative change and the community as method constructs and all of the foundational principles that go from the theory into practical application of change agent within a correctional environment. And so one of the first questions that we ask, Gateway, as Pat said, we currently serve over 12,000 people every day in contracted programs. We've been in as many as 12 states in the United States and currently in 7. And, in all of our programs, one of the first things we do when we come in to provide the services is we ask the administrative, personnel there, what is it that you want? Do you want a prison that just happens to have a drug treatment program? Or do you want a TC that happens to also be a prison? And although it sounds like it may be the same question, the two are very, very different constructs. I think that if you go to the next slide, the most effective approach is going to be integrating the TC within the prison environment and making it one and the same. So if you can advance to the next slide, please. One of the things that we found at Gateway from our experience in delivering care in these environments is that the most effective way to convince the powers that be, the supportive staff, the custody staff, the security, the wardens, the administrators, and the heads of the departments of corrections is to really get them to understand that although originally a lot of treatment programs in prisons were referred to as the hug-a-thug, really just trying to caretake and not take any accountability for what has people in an incarceration setting and trying to take away their personal responsibility. And nothing could be further from the truth. And certainly from our methodology of understanding that substance use disorder is a disease of the whole person, and that one of our predominant goals is to teach right living. And so one of the things that we have stressed is really working with our partners in departments of corrections on reframing what it is that we do and why we do it in terms that match what their priorities are. And so what we want to do is really take our programs from just being a unit in a prison that has a treatment program that nobody really notices to integrating it throughout the entire environment so that we really do have a community in action that just happens to have a fence around it. And so what we can do by integrating the two principles and the two philosophies is learn to provide support for the experiential learning of the community as method model across the entire setting and not just in the groups that our counselors happen to lead. So if you go to the next slide, one of the things that we start with is the basic premise of what is it that we're trying to do here. And I'm certainly not trying to and never would try to minimize the entirety of, the beauty of the TC model and why it works, but really to accept that as a foundation. And so I'll ask you to give me that latitude in this presentation, that all the philosophical underpinnings, the research and literature, that's the framework that begins. And so what I'm talking about in this presentation, very simply, are, how do we practically take that model and get it to its most effective status within a prison environment? And so if you look at one of the four primary goals of the TC, compassion for others, discipline and self-restraint, teaching achievement, and teaching responsibility for self and the environment, these are core goals. None of them say, don't use drugs. They don't say, don't do criminal activity. Those are assumed, byproducts of right living that evolves from a healthy TC intervention. And so coincidentally, these are very similar to correctional goals. The next slide, I have briefly highlighted what our experience, and this is not found in a textbook. This is from Gateway's experience and the programs we've operated. My 30 plus years, I don't even know how that number is possible, but several decades of working with correctional populations and realizing that their goals are about consequences, unfortunately still in many cases about punishment. And we're trying to steer the entire industry away from that basis. But prisons are also, very much about safety. about safety, protecting society from these criminals, but also protecting staff and protecting, the clients that are in the prison. They call often inmates, but protecting them from each other and from, the inability to change. Fortunately, one of the corrections goals that evolved in the last several decades, I'm happy to say, is about rehabilitation and about successful reentry, that they also have, similar goals. And so, what we've tried to do in our correctional programs across Gateway, from the earliest conversations of talking with our correctional counterparts when we assume a contract for care, is to focus on translating our values into theirs. And so when you look at something like the goal of safety and the goal of a consequence for behavior, when I talk to officers and we do immersion training and we do cross training with staff, that's an essential component of preparing the environment for a healthy TC, is really to explain to them that the TC goals of discipline and self-restraint, those are the same goals that you have. We just call them different verbiage. We have different labels for them, but it's not that we have this treatment program and we think our clients should be protected from their consequences. It's that our clients are learning to overcome their consequences through the model and the treatment interventions that we are employing. And not just that, but to learn that if we're able to do that, we should do it in a manner that is reflective throughout the entire environment of the prison and not just during the groups, as I said earlier. If you'll go to the next slide, one of the things that we've experienced over the last several years is really acknowledging, how the TCs in correctional environments have advanced. One of Gateway's first TC programs was a couple of counselors going to the Cook County Jail back in 1970 and working with a housing unit in that jail of criminal offenders, as they were labeled then, who all happened to also be suffering from opioid use disorders. And so, that early inception of Gateway's corrections division was really about acknowledging that intersection between criminality and substance use disorders and the lifestyle that goes along with that. As we established our community TC model in corrections environments and really legitimized our entire approach by having a corrections division for our agency for decades now, because of acknowledging the need for SUD treatment within criminal justice population. But the old TC, the original traditional TCs, that evolution that has been spoken about so eloquently by the previous presenters, is really about incorporating the strength of the community and taking, if you will, using Naya's concentric circles and broadening it out beyond just a drug program at a prison and really becoming about the entire environment and using the community approach throughout the institution. So we have done things like included other disciplines in treatment. So I'm including custody and the security officers in that. To be really effective, they have to be engaged, understand the methodology, be trained on the interventions, and participate as a part of the community, or at least be open and willing to support it and not be outward, disparagers of what our interventions are. We've been able to incorporate the structure and hierarchy of the TC throughout the operation of a prison. Anybody that's worked in the prison settings recognize that really, in their most basic element, a prison is a little city with a fence around it. Like there's a kitchen, there's a laundry, there are housing units, there's an education building, there's treatment buildings if we're lucky enough to have them. And really this city of sometimes thousands of individuals all locked together still has to be run. And the best way to run that from a therapeutic standpoint is to run it as if, it were a community-based therapeutic community, from both decades past and current day, of recognizing that that interdependence that exists and teaching that through every interaction within the prison. The other thing that we've done in the model and the modified version of the TC for corrections has really been a lot more overt about the kind of behavioral therapy interventions and some of the manualized curricula that, as George said, really are enhancements to the model and building off the strength of community as method. And one of the things that is the most important about our immersion training with, officers, with other disciplines, education staff, whoever we can get as in the prison population to really work with us and go through immersion training so that we can align their philosophies with the philosophies of the TC, the strength of what really changes and provides an opportunity for new life and for healthy right living that we're trying to teach. If you will move to the next slide. So there are, three primary modifications that have occurred to us over the last, several years in correctional settings that have to be overcome, right? So, the first one is in a normal prison, the work structures that I talked about, they're not always part of treatment. Like a lot of the institutions we enter, they want to run the kitchen the way custody and security does for prisons. They want to, run the laundry as a separate entity, and they want to do outside groundskeeping. And so, a separated work structure is very divergent from the community model that we have in tradition. Safety is also another thing that unfortunately in the prison setting, or fortunately, dependent on the population, of course, but safety is not strictly the responsibility of the community like it is in a traditional TC. We want the rules and expectations and guidelines and the expectations of normative behavior for the community are the strength of what provides safety within a TC. In a prison, we have fences and guards, sometimes, weapons to protect. And that is a significant barrier to the concept and the constructs of an effective TC. And you have to be aware of that. And then the last major modification that's required in corrections is this boundary thing between clients and staff, that there's a clear separation between officers, between what most of our correctional entities want, between even our clinicians and the clients, or as they call offenders or inmates. And so our real success in establishing the best modality for change for these individuals is in overcoming these barriers. And so I have a couple of slides to hit each of these points, and then I'll wrap up my comments. The next slide talks specifically about work structures. So one of the things that we have to do to get buy-in from the institution is really talk through them about the need to integrate the departments that operate that city, if you will, into treatment services. And so things that are very simple, the upward, hierarchy of jobs that occurs in the TC of coming in as, what I affectionately used to call a day one dingbat for early clients that come into the TC, recognizing, we need to give you a job because there's no free lunch and every job has merit and purpose, and you need to learn how to contribute to the community. The same thing is true in the prison, where, although it's tempted to just have, the 3 hots and a cot, verbiage about, prison care, the reality of it is we want them to learn to earn their way out of some of those consequences. And so, what we've been able to do successfully in some of our prison programs is to integrate the operational departments. And so no longer is there just a, head of laundry, there's actually a coordinator of the laundry department. And we've really infused, the work structure of the TC across the different departments in the community. We also evaluate performance jointly with the officers that are over work crews, with our clinicians and assigned clinical supervisors and counselors to really, have that integration between the care. And when we're at our most effective is when we get officers that are assigned to work units to be able to really, reiterate the constructs that are important about learning the value of achievement and, earned success and upward mobility and more responsibility. And when that gets echoed by the correctional officers, you really have them as a part of the community. The next issue that needs to be addressed and overcome is safety. And so, we already covered that prisons are there for a reason and there's a fence around them for a reason. And some of our clients have earned the right to be behind those fences. So how do we take the essential construct of safety and the community being the establisher of that normative behavior and still get it represented in a correctional environment? So the way we do it is through establishing rules and expectations for treatment and for behavior. And we learn communication across disciplines. We put literally behavioral management logs in all of the departments. So in laundry, there's a book where the officer assigned to laundry can take notes about the work structures, behavior and incidents and what may have occurred. And in terms of joint accountability, we've been able to manage operations in some institutions where they have allowed treatment professionals and clinical supervisors on our team to actually sit with what they call adjustment committees or the judges for behavioral incidents that occur within the prison community. And we actually have had successful integrations to the point where adjustment committee officers have assigned consequences of LEs to individuals who have violated prison rules. And so that level of integration really brings the element of safety and accountability across the entire environment in the prison setting in a really integrated fashion. And I think the one thing that I'm mindful of is a comment from an assistant warden that I worked with almost 2 decades ago in a fully dedicated treatment prison. And we were talking through this construct, really talking about the importance of it and about communication between, and the fact that if his officers weren't even willing to bring information to the treatment team, we would go get it. It is that important. We would send counselors to each department to get their feedback. And one of the things that he said, somewhat flippantly, but that had so much merit was, so I kind of understand this whole act as if concept. What you're basically saying is that if they're going to act as if, they're going to have to fake it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for 365 days of the year. And so if they're going to just talk about things in group and not live it elsewhere, we'll be able to know it and hold them accountable. And I said, that's exactly right. That is the pinnacle of integration within a correctional environment, to get the acknowledgement from the custody staff that they also are part of the accountability, the rational authority, if you will, and really working in a relationship and role modeling with our clients as well. And so the last issue on the next slide, if you can move to that, is really one of the paramount issues of the TC. And really it is how, in the basic philosophy of the community as method, it is about us. There is no we, they dichotomy that exists between staff and clients. I've said in many an encounter group and had, feelings run on me and been open to that as a role model in traditional settings. And although most prison TCs still do not allow clients to, sit or staff to sit in encounter groups with us, they have allowed an integration of personnel such that officers sometimes participate in groups with us. We encourage it. If they've been adequately trained, simple for the awareness of our clients and our individuals in the program to understand that we're all in this together and that we're all on this journey of not just self-discovery and awareness, but of mutual accountability, mutual responsibility, and mutual self-help. So in its most simple form, get rid of labels. Inmates, offender, they're dehumanizing, and they really are disparaging in a way that keeps individuals further away from self-worth that is discovered through healthy participation in the community. And so encourage your environments to talk about clients or patients or participants or residents. Engaging officers and counselors together, encouraging custody staff to use our same tools. We have custody staff now that give pull-ups, that even accept pull-ups at times in order to role model the appropriate response. And so, anything you can do to acknowledge that because it's a prison, the we-they dichotomy naturally exists. And so we really have to strive to go overboard to get us and to make that a prevalent philosophy within the environment. And so, with that is kind of the synopsis of the high level integration tools that we have to do and the barriers. And so I'll wrap up this with one acknowledgement that gives me encouragement for the future. And that really is about the impact of COVID. One of the things that I fully expected at the onset of COVID last year is when they stopped moving in prisons and stopped clients from being able to be sent from county jails into the prison system, when they stopped allowing in-person interventions, I fully expected that many of our correctional entities and our funders would approach us and say, we're gonna stop the contracts for now, and we're gonna send everybody home, and we'll talk to you, when this pandemic is over, as if it ever, will be. But what really occurred was this overwhelming acceptance in every single market we were in. Although we did modified care, we did some virtual groups, even for the incarcerated populations. We did written assignments being delivered to housing units. We did, in some cases, some creative email interaction communication between counselors and clients who were afforded that opportunity in their prison systems. But what we found overwhelmingly was that there was an acceptance that the services we provide in these criminal institutions are essential healthcare, even for corrections. And so that really gives me encouragement for, not just where we've been in the journey and where we're going. And so I really encourage you all. I thank you all for the work that you do every day. And I'm blessed to be part of something that believes everyone deserves the opportunity for change. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gregg. And thank you to all of the panelists and our keynote speakers for providing us with so much information today. Now let's go to the Q&A part of the webinar. I see that we have 14 questions, and due to time constraints, we may not get to all of your questions. However, we will try to follow up via email or the best way possible to get the answers to some of your questions. So our first question was, awesome presentation. What collective advocacy points should be made to funders to promote funding of optimal TC, LTC? Is there quick research outcomes to be pointed to? And it's not addressed to anyone, so whoever feels like they can answer it, please do so. And you may be on mute, so let's go to, should I just pick somebody?
Yeah.
Let's go to Dr. DeLeon. Do you have any answers for that?
This question is a very encouraging question. Are there short-term indicators of effectiveness? Well, one would be, of course, retention itself. If we're talking about community-based treatment and let's say a 9 to 12 month program, optimal program, one of the first real indicators would be, and a powerful one would be retention. If we're doing it right, if we're beginning to essentially reprogram ourselves toward high fidelity, which was the big message you've heard, at least from me today, is essentially, if fidelity is the answer, is part of the answer to this, we'll see that right away in retention. So long before we get to outcomes in terms of how clients are doing when they leave here, if we're improving retention, let's say improving completion rates of a sufficiently long program, we already know from the previous research that's going to predict higher success rates when they leave. Retention is the best predictor of higher success post-treatment.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions for Naya about where can people find your books?
My books. Whoops.
I think the curriculum books, right?
You can, whoops, sorry. We're doing a reverb thing here. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oops. Pat, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you, Naya.
Sorry about that. Probably the easiest thing would just be to email me.
Okay, we will share your email address with everybody.
Yeah, yeah, and I can actually send you an email address of Jess Lasoya. We work pretty closely together, so.
Okay, thank you. Through research, it is proven that rehabilitation is possible. How do we zero in on the most important element of change, transformation, and person-centered community? And again, I don't know if this is a Naya or a Dr. DeLeon question.
I would need some clarity on the question itself. How do we zero in on the most important element of change, transformation? I guess if I take it at face value, the change process in the therapeutic community, as we know, can be best monitored, so to speak, in a stage phase format. And if they're authentic, again, if we're running high fidelity TC-oriented programs, there should be a clear evidence of individual change at each stage. And so that once you relook at this from this perspective, the assessment strategy will be much more sophisticated. Whether a person is actually changing, whether they're still acting as if or complying, during that process of change, person-centered change in the community, they're going to go through a process of changing for various reasons. We're not necessarily going to see internalized change, even in a 9 or 12 month program, but you can measure individual change, assess individual change behaviorally and cognitively. If you've got good sensitive clinical interviewing, if the peer groups are good, we get good assessments about whether people are actually in a change process, knowing that the real payoff is going to be when they move on even and move into reentry. We do not accomplish in long-term treatment long-term recovery goals. We accomplish in long-term residential treatment the preparation to continue in the change process. And it's in many ways often the post-treatment change process that allows the individual to begin to learn to internalize change. What they have really learned, they get reaffirmed when they're out in the world, and it's the reaffirmation that produces the internalized change.
Thank you.
Sure. I just want to add one other thing in terms of going back to the funders. If you are running a therapeutic community where community method is strong, whether you are in a prison setting where people are living together, or whether you are, in residential in a larger community, there are significant reductions in violence. There are significant movement in terms of white supremacists. There's the most significant predictor for substance abuse and criminality is a substance abusing a criminal parent. We know from the longitudinal study at MIT that although foster care is a needed system, that children that have the opportunity to stay with a parent, even if it is a marginal parent, do better than children that are placed in the foster care system. And I can attest to that also anecdotally, having spent I've never worked in a TC in terms of my own career that did not work with single parents, both fathers and children, and mothers and children. So there are multiple benefits that you can talk about to funders in a robust prison TC. Let's say you have 200 people in the TC, a yard of 1,500. We've demonstrated over and over again significant reductions in violence on the prison yard. Translates to significant reductions of taxpayers' dollars. One incident in a prison yard, even without a weapon, by the time you're done with investigation and so forth and so on, and administrative segregation time can be as much as $100,000.
So, okay, we're going to thank you, Naya. We're going to go to our next question, and Naya led us very nicely into the next question. You spoke of the need to inclusion to maintain fidelity to this field and model of treatment. What are the speaker's thoughts about separating parents from children during treatment? What are some of the ways we can be more inclusive of families? And I'm going to turn to Vitka Eisen for this because she did her presentation talking about families.
I think it's incredibly problematic that we have to end up having to separate children and families. It's obviously it's challenging for the children, as Naya said. It's pretty traumatic for the children. For the children to be separated, but it also takes the family out of kind of a real world environment that they'll eventually be returning to. And so potent work can be done if you can care for the entire family together. Unfortunately, I think, as I said before, there are so many, if you're dependent on public funds, there have historically been so many restrictions on funding and restrictions on who you can bring into care. But in an ideal world, we bring the children into care. You treat the whole family because that is the greatest way to provide strengths and supports for each of them together. A parent's drug use has typically had a pretty traumatic impact on some of the people around them, either significant others and or their children. And so everyone needs care. If you want to reunite that family together, you need to be providing care for them the entire way through. And again, like I said, the only thing that prevents that is kind of the disjointed way that care is funded in this country, not because we who are experts in this field think that that's a good way to do it.
Thanks, Vitka. We have another question. I would be interested in learning more about the probational substance use treatment meetings. Is this different from TC staffing? Thank you. And I'm going to ask that Gregg Dockins take that question. I jumped around.
Well, I appreciate that. We have, programs where we have joint staffings between the custody officer team as well as, the treatment team. And so from our perspective, as much engagement as we can have across disciplines with that information, the more real it is. And that, sometimes it hurts the feelings of our clinicians that we hire, but the reality of it is in a prison setting and oftentimes in a traditional TC, the person that you see in group may not be the same person that is walking around the community and the environment. And so the more representation that you can get from the entire prison context, the more real information you're going to have about clients. And so we try to engage both parties, both formally and informally in that level of communication.
Thanks, Greg.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, this will be our last question due to time constraints, but again, we do want to answer all of your questions. And I'm going to give this question to John or Debbie. And Debbie, how do we deal with burnout fatigue of staff and TC members?
Okay, I'll start, and John, I know you'll pick up. I think it's definitely doing a lot of wellness is what we find. Really giving staff the opportunity to engage in different types of activities where it's caring for themselves. And also a lot of support around training. We also make sure that we do a lot of supervision that is supportive type of supervision that really begins to address their experience and of areas of frustration or areas of things that they know that they want to do better at, and really sort of working those three avenues on a very consistent basis. John, I know you want to add some.
Unmute. I think in addition from an adolescent slant with my adolescent step, as many folks could imagine, the burnout working with teenagers can be tremendous, you know, having 50 teenagers under one roof. And I think a couple of the things that we do is when we talked about earlier about making treatment fun because they're kids and fun activities, one of the things that we encourage our staff to do as well is to get in and participate in those fun activities, which does two things. It decompresses the staff, it's cathartic for the staff, and it allows the kids to see the staff outside of their traditional role, which, you know, kind of builds that therapeutic alliance with them. So, you know, that's certainly one of them right there. The other thing also is strategically, you know, we work with our folks to really use a tag team approach with kids. You know, kids at times who would be standing to receive information or acting out, they'll wear a staff member down, and, you know, time is on your side, and basically to step away and call in for the fresh person to come in what that does is it breaks the power struggle. And very often now the kid who's locked into the power struggle, you'll never win the power struggle with a teenager. Never, 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 ever. So I think that tag team approach will reduce tremendous burnout on a day-to-day, shift to shift, the amount of incidents, you know, just to put in perspective with COVID, the masking piece with teenagers was kind of like, if you could imagine how many times you need to tell an adolescent to pull their pants up a little bit because they're always riding low. That's how often our staff had to remind them to put their mask on properly. So you talk about burnout, just, you know, day in, day out. So those are just two strategic pieces.
Thank you, John and Debbie. And that was our last question. And again, we'll share our contact information of all our presenters today. And now I'm going to turn it over to Ed Carlson, TCA President, for some closing remarks.
Thank you very much. Dr. Taylor, would you like to say a few closing words from WFTC?
I would. I'd like to thank the presenters. They were excellent. I just wish we had more time. I think we should just do it again. And for those of you who are not members of the World Federation, here's an open invitation to join. We'd love to have your participation, your expertise, your talent, and your commitment. It'd be wonderful. Thanks again, Ed and Pat, Steve, for doing the heavy lifting to make this happen. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Taylor. We really appreciate WFTC and the work that they're doing internationally. Special shout out to all of our friends internationally who are staying up late or up early in the morning or in the middle of the night listening to our presentation. We really do appreciate that. So I want to tell everyone that that's a wrap. I hope everybody enjoyed TCA's, the changing aspect of the therapeutic community model training. TCA's goal is to have more of these in the future and to really open it up for people to be active and engaged. And I think there was a question also about trying to get CEUs for this. So we'll definitely be working on that as an added aspect. So that way staff and other people can help participate. I want to thank our keynote speakers, Dr. DeLeon and Naya Arbiter. You all were really amazing, and we appreciate you all volunteering your time and doing this for us. I want to thank all our TC member panels for volunteering their time and the work and effort that they put in. And most importantly, I want to thank all of our attendees I want to give a quick shout out to Ann Tucker, who's pulling all the strings behind here, as well as Lonnie Granier, who has been doing a lot of work, and all of Ann's staff and all of the other people that jumped on board to help. We really, really appreciate it. And we hope that this was a valuable resource to you, and we hope to do additional trainings in the future. As a reminder, this is recorded training, and we will notify attendees when the recording is available. Again, thank you to everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day. We have a little Rebirth brass band closing out from New Orleans. Rebirth, like everybody's being reborn again once they're going through treatment and the TC experience. Thank you all very much, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ed.
Great job.